Montana Territory. Winter of 1869. The night lay thick and heavy across the land, snow falling in silent sheets that buried the horizon. A full moon struggled behind clouds, casting eerie shadows across the endless white expanse. A woman's scream tore through the stillness, sharp and desperate, followed by the muffled sound of running footsteps crunching in snow. A dark figure stumbled forward, then collapsed. Blood bloomed red against the pristine white, spreading like spilled ink. Through the crack of a slightly open door, a child's wide eyes watched, unblinking. 3 years later, Rebecca Hayes pulled her woolen cloak tighter against the bitter Montana wind. The stagecoach had left her at the crossroads 2 miles back, the driver unwilling to venture further with a storm approaching. Now she trudged alone through deepening snow, her small travel trunk dragging behind her, leaving a single track in the gathering whiteness. The letter from the Missouri Matrimonial Agency was tucked safely in her pocket, promising a new beginning at Whispering Pines Ranch. "Mr. Theodore Palmer awaits you with anticipation," the letter had read. "A fine property suitable for family life." Family life. Rebecca's hand instinctively moved to her side, where beneath layers of clothing lay a twisted scar, a permanent reminder of the field hospital explosion that had taken more from her than just unmarked skin. The army doctor's words still echoed, "You've survived, which is miracle enough, but children will not be possible." Snow began falling harder, obscuring the path ahead. Rebecca squinted through the whiteness, searching for any sign of Whispering Pines. Instead, through the thickening veil of snowflakes, she glimpsed the dark silhouette of a house. Not the grand ranch she'd been promised in the letter, but shelter nonetheless. As she approached, she made out a weathered sign swinging on rusty hinges, "Blackwood Ranch." Rebecca hesitated. This wasn't her destination, but night was falling and the storm intensified with each passing minute. She had no choice. The ranch house stood solid against the gathering storm, a 2-story structure of rough-hewn timber that had weathered many winters. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the stone chimney, the only sign of life within. Rebecca's frozen fingers formed a fist, and she knocked on the heavy wooden door. Silence followed. She knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open just enough to reveal a man's face half in shadow. His eyes, a deep stormy blue, regarded her with suspicion. "What do you want?" His voice was low, rough from disuse. Rebecca straightened her back, refusing to be intimidated despite the man's imposing presence. "I apologize for the intrusion. My name is Rebecca Hayes. I'm trying to reach Whispering Pines Ranch, but the storm—" "You're miles off course," the man interrupted. "Whispering Pines is on the other side of the valley." A fierce gust of wind pushed against Rebecca's back, nearly toppling her forward. "Please," she said. "I can't go any further tonight. May I stay until morning?" The man's gaze traveled past her to the worsening storm, then back to her face. For a long moment, he seemed to be weighing something in his mind. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he stepped back. "One night," he said. "You leave at first light." Rebecca nodded gratefully and stepped across the threshold into the warmth of the house. The man, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that brushed his collar, watched her with a guarded expression. "Mason Blackwood," he said by way of introduction, taking her trunk and setting it by the door. "This is my ranch." The interior of the house was Spartan, but solid. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, with rough wooden furniture arranged before it. A rifle hung above the mantel. The flames cast dancing shadows across a floor that had been swept but not recently polished. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, emptiness perhaps, the unmistakable scent of a home that had once held more life than it did now. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," Rebecca said, removing her snow-covered cloak. "I'm very grateful." Mason didn't respond. He moved to the fireplace and added another log, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "There's stew on the stove," he said without turning. "Help yourself. Spare rooms at the top of the stairs, first door on the left." With that, he crossed to a desk in the corner, effectively dismissing her. Rebecca stood awkwardly for a moment, then moved toward the kitchen. As she ladled the simple stew into a bowl, she surveyed her surroundings more carefully. The kitchen was functional, but showed signs of neglect. A fine layer of dust on the higher shelves, a cracked plate set aside. On the wall hung a child's drawing faded with age. She leaned closer, making out a crude rendering of a man, a woman, and a small figure between them, all holding hands beneath a yellow sun. As she ate the surprisingly flavorful stew, Rebecca's attention was drawn to other small details that suggested this wasn't a bachelor's home. A rocking chair with a small cushion, a shelf with a few children's books, a tiny pair of boots by the back door. Yet there was no sound of a child, no sign of a woman. Rebecca had nearly finished her meal when a floorboard creaked behind her. She turned quickly and found herself looking at empty space until she lowered her gaze. A little girl stood in the doorway, barefoot, in a faded blue nightgown. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old, with honey-brown hair that fell in tangled waves to her shoulders. Her eyes, the same stormy blue as Mason's, watched Rebecca with a wariness no child should possess. Rebecca smiled gently. "Hello there," she said, keeping her voice soft. "My name is Rebecca." "What's yours?" The child didn't answer. She didn't even blink. "Lily." Rebecca startled at Mason's voice from the doorway. He stood with his arms crossed, watching the child with an unreadable expression. "Her name is Lily," he repeated. "She doesn't speak." Rebecca looked back at the little girl, recognition dawning in her eyes. She had seen that look before in the eyes of children brought to field hospitals after witnessing the horrors of war. Children who had seen things no child should see. "Hello, Lily," Rebecca said softly. "It's nice to meet you." Lily remained silent, her small fingers twisting in the fabric of her nightgown. "She should be in bed," Mason said, his tone gentler than before. "Lily, go back upstairs." To Rebecca's surprise, the child didn't move. Instead, those solemn blue eyes remained fixed on her with an intensity that was almost unsettling. Mason sighed, crossing the room in long strides. He knelt beside his daughter. "It's late, little one," he said, his voice changing completely, softer now, tinged with a tenderness that transformed his entire countenance. "Our guest will still be here in the morning." Lily's eyes flicked to her father, then back to Rebecca. Finally, with obvious reluctance, she turned and padded silently back toward the stairs. "You have a beautiful daughter," Rebecca said, once the child had gone. Mason's face closed again. "She's been through a lot." "Has she always been silent?" A muscle in his jaw tightened. "No, not always." He turned away, effectively ending the conversation. "The spare room has fresh linens. There's water in the pitcher for washing." Rebecca recognized the dismissal. "Thank you again for your hospitality, Mr. Blackwood." He nodded once, not looking at her, and Rebecca made her way upstairs, bone-weary from her journey. The spare room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small chest of drawers. A patchwork quilt in faded blues and greens covered the bed. The window rattled against the intensifying storm outside. Rebecca set her small travel bag on the bed and removed her most treasured possession, a handkerchief embroidered with a delicate dove, and the words, "For those who cannot fly home." It had been a gift from Sophia, along with a desperate plea, Find Victoria. Tell her I'm safe. She traced the embroidery with her fingertip, remembering Sophia's fearful eyes. I'm trying, she whispered to the empty room. I'm trying to keep my promise. Rebecca was nearly asleep when something crinkled beneath her pillow. Frowning, she reached underneath and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Unfolding it revealed a child's drawing, crude figures sketched in charcoal. A man holding what appeared to be a knife. A woman lying in the snow. Another woman running into trees. At the bottom, in shaky, childish handwriting, he made Mama sleep. Rebecca's blood ran cold. She stared at the drawing, her mind racing. What had this child witnessed? What darkness lurked beneath the roof of Blackwood Ranch? Outside, the wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the windows in their frames. Rebecca carefully refolded the drawing and tucked it into her bag. Sleep would be long in coming this night. Dawn broke pale and hesitant over Blackwood Ranch, the storm having exhausted itself sometime in the night. Rebecca stood at the window of the spare room, watching as the sun transformed the snow-covered landscape into a sea of diamonds. In the harsh light of morning, the ranch revealed itself more fully. A barn and corral stood to the west of the main house, while to the east stretched fenced pastures now buried under snow. Beyond that, the dark line of pine forest marked the boundary between civilization and wilderness. The drawing she'd found weighed heavily on her mind. Rebecca unfolded it again, studying the crude figures with a growing sense of unease. Whatever this child had witnessed had silenced her more effectively than any physical ailment could. Rebecca had seen such trauma before. During the war, she'd treated not just soldiers but civilians, too, women and children caught in the crossfire of a nation tearing itself apart. Some wounds left no visible scars, yet ran deeper than any bullet could penetrate. She tucked the drawing away and made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee. Mason stood at the stove, his back to her, while Lily sat at the table, a bowl of porridge untouched before her. The child looked up as Rebecca entered, her solemn eyes watchful. "Good morning," Rebecca said. Mason turned coffee pot in hand. "Storm's past," he said without preamble. "Road to town should be clear enough by midday." Rebecca nodded, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "Thank you." She sat at the table across from Lily, offering the child a gentle smile. "Good morning, Lily." The girl didn't smile back, but her gaze remained fixed on Rebecca, with that same unsettling intensity as the night before. "Did you sleep well?" Mason asked the question, more formality than genuine interest. "Yes, thank you," Rebecca lied. In truth, she'd lain awake for hours, the child's drawing and the mystery it represented keeping sleep at bay. Silence fell over the kitchen, broken only by the crackle of the fire in the stove and the occasional clink of spoons against bowls. Through the window, Rebecca could see the vast whiteness stretching to the horizon. The storm had left at least a foot of fresh snow. Travel would be difficult at best. "Mr. Blackwood," she began cautiously, "I fear the roads may be impassable today. Would it be an imposition to remain another night? I would be happy to earn my keep. I notice your daughter's hair could use some attention, and I'm quite skilled with household tasks." And Mason studied her over the rim of his coffee cup, his expression unreadable. "You're expected at Whispering Pines," he said. "They don't know precisely when I'm to arrive," Rebecca countered. The stage was already delayed in Fort Benton due to weather. He seemed to consider this, his gaze moving from Rebecca to his daughter, whose tangled hair indeed told the tale of a man unaccustomed to caring for a young girl's needs. "You can stay another night," he said finally. "But I'll take you to town tomorrow, weather permitting or not." Rebecca nodded, relieved. "Thank you." After breakfast, Mason donned his heavy coat and gloves. "I need to check the herd," he said. The cattle shelter in the stand of pines during storms. Some always manage to wander too far. I'll tidy up here, Rebecca offered, and perhaps see to Lily's hair if she'll allow it. Mason hesitated, looking at his daughter. She doesn't usually take to strangers. I have some experience with children who have experienced difficulties, Rebecca said carefully. During the war. Something flickered in Mason's eyes, recognition perhaps. You were a nurse. Yes, field hospitals mostly, with the Union forces. His expression hardened slightly. I served as well. Southern forces. Major Mason Blackwood until Appomattox. The revelation hung between them. They had been enemies once, on opposite sides of a bloody divide. Rebecca held his gaze steadily. The war is over, Mr. Blackwood. We're all just trying to find our way home now. After a moment, he nodded curtly and turned to Lily. Be good for Miss Hayes, he said softly. The child gave no indication she'd heard, but Mason seemed to take her silence as agreement. With a final nod to Rebecca, he strode from the house. Left alone with Lily, Rebecca moved deliberately, washing the breakfast dishes while keeping up a gentle monologue. This is a beautiful home your father has built, she said. And what a lovely view from the window. Do you like to watch the snow fall, Lily? I do. Each snowflake is different, you know. No two are exactly alike. The child remained at the table watching Rebecca with those unblinking blue eyes. There was intelligence there and awareness. Lily understood everything around her. She simply chose not to speak. When the dishes were done, Rebecca dried her hands and turned to the little girl. Would you like me to brush your hair? I could braid it for you if you'd like. Lily didn't respond, but she didn't move away either. Rebecca took this as permission and retrieved her own hairbrush from her bag. With slow, gentle movements, she began working through the tangles in Lily's honey-brown hair. As she brushed, she hummed softly an old lullaby her mother had sung to her as a child. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, she felt the child relax beneath her hands. By the time she had worked through all the tangles and begun plaiting the silky strands into a neat braid, Lily's shoulders had lost some of their rigidity. There, Rebecca said, securing the braid with a ribbon from her own hair. Would you like to see? She held up a small hand mirror from the mantelpiece, angling it so Lily could see her reflection. For just a moment so brief, Rebecca almost missed it. The child's lips curved upward in the ghost of a smile. You look very pretty, Rebecca said warmly. Your mama would be proud. Lily's almost smile vanished, her small body tensing again. She slid from the chair and moved to the window, her back to Rebecca, small fingers pressed against the glass as she stared out at the snow. Rebecca mentally chastised herself for the misstep. She should have known better than to mention the child's mother. Whatever had happened in this house, whatever had rendered this little girl mute, clearly involved her mother. I'm sorry, Lily, she said softly. I didn't mean to upset you. The child didn't turn, continuing to stare out at the endless white. Rebecca sighed and returned to her tasks, giving Lily the space she clearly needed. As the day progressed, Rebecca found herself drawn to the small signs of feminine presence that lingered in the house. A sewing basket tucked beneath a side table, a pressed flower bookmark in a volume of Tennyson's poems, a silver-backed hairbrush on the mantel still holding a few strands of golden hair. In the parlor, she discovered a piano, its surface dusty, the keys yellowed with age. Rebecca ran her fingers lightly over the lid, imagining the music that had once filled this now silent house. She resisted the urge to open it, sensing that, like so many things in this household, the piano was a monument to someone gone, but not forgotten. In the afternoon, Rebecca settled by the fire with her own small sewing kit, mending a tear in her traveling dress. Lily had retreated to a corner of the room with a book of illustrations, Though Rebecca noticed she wasn't turning the pages, just staring at a single image. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with unspoken questions. Rebecca decided to fill it with something that might reach the child. When I was a nurse during the war, she began, her hands continuing their steady work with needle and thread. I met a boy about your age. His name was Thomas. He had been separated from his family when their farm burned. He wouldn't speak to anyone, not to the doctors, not to the other nurses. Everyone thought perhaps he couldn't speak at all. Lily didn't look up from her book, but Rebecca sensed she was listening. One day I gave Thomas some paper and charcoal. He couldn't tell us what had happened to him, but he could draw it. And he did page after page of drawings. Through those pictures we learned where his farm had been. We found his mother, who had been searching for him for months. Rebecca paused in her sewing, looking directly at Lily. Sometimes, when our words fail us, pictures can speak instead. Lily's eyes lifted from the book, meeting Rebecca's gaze. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the room, some understanding passing between them that needed no words. The moment broke when the front door opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air and Mason's imposing figure. Snow dusted his coat and hat, and his cheeks were ruddy from the cold. "Storm left drifts higher than a man's head in some places," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Lost 2 calves, but the rest of the herd weathered it well enough." His eyes moved from Rebecca to Lily, noting the neat braid. Something like gratitude flickered across his features. "Her hair looks nice." "She was very patient," Rebecca replied. Mason nodded, removing his coat and hanging it by the door. "You said you were bound for Whispering Pines," he said, changing the subject. "Theodore Palmer's place." "Yes, I'm to be married." Mason's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've never met the man?" "No, the arrangement was made through the Missouri Matrimonial Agency." Rebecca kept her voice matter-of-fact, though she felt a flush creeping up her neck at his obvious judgment. "You're traveling across the country to marry a stranger. Many women do, Mr. Blackwood. There are few options for a woman alone, especially." She trailed off, unwilling to speak of her inability to bear children in front of Lily. "Especially," he prompted. "Especially one with my particular circumstances," she finished quietly. He seemed about to press further when Lily suddenly appeared at his side, tugging at his sleeve. She held up her book, pointing to an illustration of a bird. Mason's entire demeanor softened as he knelt to his daughter's level. "Yes, like the ones by the creek," he said gently. "We'll look for them when spring comes." The transformation was remarkable, from stern, forbidding rancher to tender father in an instant. Rebecca watched the interaction with growing curiosity about the man who contained such contradictions. Later, as daylight waned and shadows lengthened across the snow, Rebecca found herself alone in the kitchen, preparing supper. Mason had gone to check on a mare about to foal, and Lily had retreated upstairs. Rebecca hummed softly as she worked, finding comfort in the familiar tasks of slicing bread and stirring the soup she'd found simmering on the back of the stove. A soft sound made her turn. Lily stood in the doorway, holding a piece of paper. The child approached cautiously, then held out the paper to Rebecca. It was another drawing, this one showing 3 figures standing before what appeared to be the ranch house. A tall man, a smaller woman with long hair, and between them a little girl. All were holding hands. Unlike the disturbing drawing from the night before, this one portrayed something hopeful of family. "Is this your family, Lily?" Rebecca asked gently. "You and your father and mother." Lily shook her head slowly, then pointed at the female figure, then at Rebecca. Rebecca's breath caught. "That's me," Lily nodded, the barest movement of her head. "And this is you and your father," Rebecca continued, pointing to the other figures. Another nod. Rebecca felt something twist in her chest, a complex emotion she couldn't immediately name. This silent child, who had witnessed something terrible enough to steal her voice, had drawn Rebecca into her world, placed her in the position of the missing mother. "It's a beautiful drawing," she said, her voice thick. "Thank you for showing me." Lily's solemn eyes studied Rebecca's face, seeming to search for something. Then, in a gesture that nearly stopped Rebecca's heart, she reached out and took Rebecca's hand in her small one. Just for a moment, a brief, warm pressure of tiny fingers, and then she was gone, disappearing back upstairs as silently as she had come. Rebecca stood motionless in the kitchen, the drawing in one hand, the phantom warmth of Lily's touch lingering on the other. Whatever had happened in this house had left wounds still raw and bleeding. And somehow, in less than 2 days, she had been drawn into their pain. The thought of leaving tomorrow for Whispering Pines for a marriage to a stranger suddenly felt like abandonment. But she had a promise to keep, a mission that had brought her to Montana in the first place. Find Victoria. Tell her I'm safe. Victoria Blackwood. The name on the letter Sophia had pressed into her hands before disappearing into the night. Could it be mere coincidence that Rebecca had found herself at a ranch named Blackwood? The sound of the front door opening broke her reverie. Mason stomped snow from his boots, bringing with him the crisp scent of winter. "Mare's fine," he said. "Colt's healthy. They'll both make it." His eyes fell on the drawing in Rebecca's hand. "Lily's work," Rebecca nodded, handing it to him. "She gave it to me." Mason studied the drawing, his expression softening. "She's drawn you," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "She never draws people she doesn't know." "Children often see more than we realize," Rebecca said carefully. "They sense things adults miss." Mason folded the drawing and handed it back to her, his expression guarded once more. "Soup smells good," he said, changing the subject. "I'll fetch Lily for supper." That night, after a quiet meal, where the only sound was the clink of spoons against bowls, Rebecca returned to her room with more questions than answers. She sat on the edge of the bed, removed her boots, and reached for her bag to retrieve her nightgown. Her fingers brushed against something unexpected, a small wooden object tucked between her folded clothes. She drew it out, finding a carved wooden bird small enough to fit in her palm. The workmanship was simple but beautiful, the bird's wings spread as if in flight. A gift from Lily. Rebecca realized. The child who did not speak had found other ways to communicate, through drawings, through touch, and now through this small token. Rebecca placed the wooden bird carefully on the bedside table and prepared for bed, her mind filled with the mysteries of Blackwood Ranch. As she drifted toward sleep, her thoughts returned to the disturbing drawing she'd found the night before. He made Mama sleep. Who was he? What had happened to Lily's mother? And why did Rebecca feel with increasing certainty that her search for Victoria and her promise to Sophia had led her exactly where she needed to be? Rebecca's dreams were fragmented and uneasy. She stood in a field hospital, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Around her, men moaned in pain, while surgeons worked with grim efficiency, discarding severed limbs like firewood. A boy, no more than 8, lay on a cot before her, his eyes glassy with approaching death, lips moving soundlessly. Rebecca leaned closer, straining to hear his whispered words. "Mama," he breathed. "Don't leave me, Mama." "I'm here," she heard herself say, though she was not his mother. "I won't leave you." The boy's face blurred, transforming into Lily's solemn countenance. "He made Mama sleep," the child whispered. And then the dream shifted, and Rebecca was running through snow pursuing a shadowy figure that always remained just out of reach. Blood trailed behind the figure, staining the pristine whiteness. "Victoria!" Rebecca called. "Victoria, wait!" She woke with a gasp, heart pounding. The room was dark, the fire in the small grate having died down to embers. Outside, the wind had picked up again, moaning around the eaves of the house like a restless spirit. Rebecca sat up, pushing tangled hair from her face. These nightmares were not new. They had plagued her since the war, since the field hospital explosion that had left her scarred in body and spirit. But this one had been different, blending past trauma with present mysteries. Unable to return to sleep, she lit the small lamp beside the bed and retrieved her journal from her bag. If sleep would not come, she could at least put her thoughts in order. "Dear Sophia," she wrote, though she had no way to send the letter. "I have found myself at a ranch called Blackwood, though not the Blackwood we sought. The master of this house is called Mason, not James. He has a daughter named Lily, who does not speak, and a wife who is absent, whether by death or abandonment, I cannot yet determine. There is sadness in this house and secrets. The child has drawn disturbing pictures that suggest violence. I cannot help but wonder if there is some connection to our Victoria. Could this Mason be related to James Blackwood? The coincidence seems too great to ignore." She paused, tapping the pencil against the page. "I am supposed to continue to Whispering Pines tomorrow to fulfill my obligation to the matrimonial agency. But something holds me here. Perhaps it is just the mystery, or perhaps it is the silent child who has already claimed a piece of my heart, or perhaps it is the promise I made to you to find your sister and ensure her safety." A sound from the hallway made Rebecca freeze, pencil poised above the page. Soft footsteps padded past her door, too light to be Mason's. Lily awake at this hour, Rebecca set aside her journal and rose, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Quietly, she opened her door and peered into the darkened hallway. A small figure stood at the far end, silhouetted against the window, where moonlight filtered through clouds. Not Lily. The shape was wrong. A woman. Rebecca blinked, and the figure was gone like mist dissolving in sunlight. Heart pounding, Rebecca stepped into the hallway. "Hello," she whispered. No answer came but the creaking of the house as it settled in the cold. She made her way to the window, peering out at the moonlit landscape. Nothing moved across the pristine snow. No footprints, no sign that anyone had left the house. Had she imagined it? A remnant of her dream, perhaps overlapping with reality, in the disorientation of waking. Rebecca turned to go back to her room when something on the floor caught her eye, a glint of gold in the moonlight. She knelt, finding a single long blonde hair, too fair to belong to either dark-haired Mason or honey-haired Lily. She was still staring at the hair when a voice spoke from the shadows. "You should be asleep." Rebecca started, nearly losing her balance. Mason stood at the top of the stairs, a lamp in one hand casting his face in sharp relief. He wore only trousers and an undershirt, his feet bare hair tousled from sleep. "I heard something," Rebecca said, rising to her feet. "Someone in the hallway." Mason's expression remained impassive, but she noted the tightening of his jaw. "The house makes noises in the cold," he said. "Wood contracting, wind in the eaves." "It wasn't the house," Rebecca insisted. "I saw someone." "You were dreaming." His tone left no room for argument. "Go back to bed, Miss Hayes." Rebecca stood her ground. "Mr. Blackwood, I am not a fanciful woman given to imagining things. I saw a figure by this window, A woman, I believe. And this, she held up the blonde hair. This is not from dreaming. Mason crossed the space between them in 3 long strides, taking the hair from her fingers. His face, half in shadow, revealed nothing. My wife had blonde hair, he said flatly. The house is full of reminders. Now, if you're quite finished with your midnight explorations, I suggest you return to your room. The dismissal was clear, but Rebecca had never been one to retreat from unpleasant truths. Your wife, she said. What happened to her, Mr. Blackwood? For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. He stood motionless, the lamp casting strange shadows across his features. When he spoke, his voice was low, controlled, as if each word cost him. Victoria died 3 years ago. An accident. What kind of accident? His eyes, cold now, remote, met hers. The kind that leaves a child without a mother and a man with questions he can't answer. Good night, Miss Hayes. He turned and strode back toward his room, taking the light with him and leaving Rebecca in darkness. She stood by the window long after he'd gone, the blonde hair forgotten, her mind churning with new information. Victoria, the name from Sophia's letter. The wife Mason had just mentioned. Could they be one and the same? Rebecca returned to her room, sleep now further from reach than ever. She retrieved the letter from Sophia from her bag, rereading the words she had memorized months ago. Find Victoria. Tell her I'm safe. James Blackwood will not find me where I've gone, but Victoria must know the truth. She must know I am alive, and that he did not succeed in silencing me. The enclosed will prove I am well. The enclosed had been the embroidered handkerchief, the dove, with its message of hope for those who could not fly home. And now, by what seemed like providence, Rebecca had found herself at a ranch called Blackwood, with a man whose wife was named Victoria. But Mason, not James. And Victoria, dead, not missing. Unless Mason had lied. Unless the figure Rebecca had glimpsed was no ghost or dream, but Victoria herself, hiding within the walls of her own home. But why would she hide from her husband and child? The mystery deepened, and with it Rebecca's resolve to uncover the truth. Tomorrow she was supposed to leave for Whispering Pines to meet Theodore Palmer and fulfill her contract with the matrimonial agency. But how could she leave now, with so many questions unanswered? Sleep, when it finally came, was thin and restless. Rebecca woke to gray dawn light filtering through the window, her body aching with fatigue. She dressed quickly, conscious that this was supposed to be her last morning at Blackwood Ranch. By nightfall, she would be at Whispering Pines, beginning the new life she had traveled so far to claim. The thought brought no joy, only a hollow sense of obligation. Downstairs, she found Mason already at the stove cooking bacon in a cast-iron skillet. Lily sat at the table, her hair once again a tangled mess around her shoulders. The child looked up as Rebecca entered, and a small hand lifted in what might have been a wave. "Good morning," Rebecca said, managing a smile despite her exhaustion. "Did you sleep well, Lily?" The child nodded, a small but definite movement. Progress, Rebecca thought. Yesterday, there would have been no response at all. Mason glanced over his shoulder. "Coffee's hot," he said, his tone giving no indication of their midnight encounter. "We'll leave for town after breakfast. Road should be passable by now." Rebecca poured herself a cup of coffee, warming her hands around the mug. "About that," she began. "I've been thinking." A sharp knock at the door interrupted her. Mason frowned, setting down the spatula. "Stay here," he said, and moved to the front of the house. Rebecca heard the door open, followed by a man's voice unfamiliar with the crisp consonants of Eastern education. "Blackwood, the voice said. "Thought I'd stop by on my way to town. Sheriff sent me to check on outlying ranches after the storm." "We're fine here, Harlow." Mason's reply was curt. "No need for concern." "The sheriff insists. After what happened at the Peterson place last winter, he's taking no chances." Footsteps approached the kitchen, and Rebecca turned to see Mason re-enter, followed by a man she didn't recognize. He was tall and lean, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. A long scar ran from his right temple to his jaw, pulling his mouth into a slight permanent grimace. He wore a well-made coat and polished boots, not the typical attire of a ranch hand or local lawman. "Miss Hayes," Mason said, his reluctance evident, "this is Griffin Harlow, former lieutenant in the Confederate Army, now a businessman in our community." "Charmed," Harlow said, removing his hat to reveal hair the color of wheat straw. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, assessed Rebecca with undisguised interest. Mason didn't mention he had a guest. "Miss Hayes was caught in the storm," Mason explained. "She'll be leaving for Whispering Pines today." "Palmer's place." Harlow raised an eyebrow. "Business or pleasure?" "Neither is your concern," Rebecca replied coolly, disliking the man on instinct. There was something predatory in his gaze, something that set her nerves on edge. A movement caught her attention, Lily sliding from her chair and backing toward the wall, her eyes intent and fixed on Harlow. The child's face had gone pale, her small body rigid with what Rebecca immediately recognized as fear. Harlow noticed, too. "Hello there, little miss," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Still not talking, I see." Lily pressed herself against the wall, looking like she might bolt at any moment. Mason moved to his daughter's side, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Lily isn't feeling well this morning," he said. "You'll excuse her." Harlow shrugged. "Children," he said dismissively. "Never could abide them myself." His gaze returned to Rebecca. "You're bound for Palmer's ranch. You say I'm heading that direction myself. Perhaps I could escort you." Before Rebecca could respond, Mason cut in. "That won't be necessary. I've already agreed to take Miss Hayes to town." Something passed between the two men, an old tension, a history Rebecca could only guess at. Harlow's smile tightened. "Always the gentleman, aren't you, Major Blackwood, even after everything?" Mason's expression hardened. "State your business, Harlow, then be on your way. We were about to have breakfast." Harlow made a show of looking around the kitchen. "Just checking that all is well as the sheriff requested. Though I must say you seem to be doing better than expected. A pretty guest, a functioning ranch." His gaze lingered on Rebecca. "Life goes on, doesn't it? Despite the unpleasantness." "If that's all," Mason said, moving toward the door in a clear invitation for Harlow to leave. "For now," Harlow settled his hat back on his head, tipping it slightly to Rebecca. "Miss Hayes, a pleasure. Perhaps we'll meet again in town." His eyes slid to Lily, who still huddled against the wall. "Take care, little one. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows." The words, innocent enough on the surface, carried an undercurrent that made Rebecca's skin crawl. Mason evidently felt it too, for his hand moved instinctively to where a sidearm would hang, though he wore none. After Harlow had gone, the kitchen remained silent. Mason stood at the window watching until the man's horse disappeared down the road. Lily remained frozen against the wall, her eyes wide and frightened. Rebecca moved to the child, kneeling to her level. "He's gone now," she said softly. "You're safe." Lily's eyes met hers, filled with a knowledge and fear no child should possess. Without warning, the little girl threw herself into Rebecca's arms, small body, trembling like a cornered rabbit. Rebecca held her close, looking up at Mason over the child's head. "Who is he?" she asked quietly. Really? Mason's face was a mask of controlled rage. A remnant of the past, he said. One that won't seem to stay buried. He frightens Lily. Yes. The single word contained volumes of unspoken history. Why? Mason turned from the window, his eyes meeting hers. Because she saw what he did, he said simply. And he knows it. The bacon had burned in the skillet, filling the kitchen with the acrid smell of charred meat. No one moved to salvage it. Lily remained in Rebecca's arms, her face buried against her shoulder. Mason stood by the window, tension radiating from him like heat from a stove. In that moment, Rebecca knew she could not leave for Whispering Pines. Not today. Perhaps not ever. Whatever secrets lurked in the shadows of Blackwood Ranch, they were entwined with her promise to Sophia, with the mystery of Victoria, and now with this silent child who clung to her as if to a lifeline. Mr. Blackwood, she said, her decision made. I'd like to postpone my journey to Whispering Pines. There are questions I need answered first. Mason looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. What questions? About your wife Victoria, about Griffin Harlow, and about what really happened 3 years ago that left your daughter afraid to speak. She expected anger, or at least resistance. Instead, Mason's shoulders seemed to slump slightly, as if some great weight had settled more firmly upon them. Those aren't pleasant stories, Miss Hayes. Few true stories are, in my experience, Rebecca replied, still holding Lily close. But they must be told nonetheless. Mason nodded once, a decision reached. Very well, but not in front of Lily. He crossed to where they sat and gently touched his daughter's hair. Little one, why don't you go upstairs and choose a book? Miss Hayes and I need to talk, and then perhaps she'll read to you. Lily lifted her head from Rebecca's shoulder, looking first at her father, then at Rebecca, as if seeking confirmation. Rebecca smiled gently. I'll be right here, she promised. You choose a good story for us. After a moment's hesitation, Lily extricated herself from Rebecca's embrace and padded silently up the stairs. Once she was out of earshot, Mason sank heavily into a chair at the table, suddenly looking far older than his years. You asked about Victoria, he began, his voice low. My wife, Lily's mother. She disappeared 3 years ago on a night much like the one you arrived, snowing heavily, wind howling like a banshee. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. We had argued earlier that evening. I had been drinking too much, as was my habit in those days. I don't remember what the argument was about. Something trivial, most likely. He stared at his hands spread flat on the table, strong hands calloused from ranch work, a thin band of paler skin where a wedding ring had once rested. I passed out by the fire. When I woke the next morning, Victoria was gone. Her coat was missing, but nothing else. Not her bag, not her hairbrush, none of the things a woman would take if she were leaving her home. And Lily, Rebecca prompted gently. Lily was in her bed, silent as stone. She hasn't spoken a word since that morning. Not to me, not to the doctor from town, not to anyone. You said it was an accident, Rebecca said. Earlier you told me Victoria died in an accident. Mason's eyes haunted and hollow met hers. That's the story I tell. The truth is, I don't know what happened. All I know is that I woke with blood on my shirt and my wife gone. The Sheriff Harlow's friend, as it happens, found footprints leading from the house into the woods. One set going, none coming back. The implications hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. You think she's dead? Rebecca said. I know she is, Mason replied quietly. No woman would leave her child willingly, not Victoria. She adored Lily. Whatever happened that night, Whatever I did or didn't do, it ended with Victoria gone and Lily broken. You don't remember anything from that night. Fragments, the argument, Victoria crying, Lily watching from the stairs. Then nothing until morning. Rebecca absorbed this, her mind racing. And Griffin Harlow, what's his role in all this? A muscle in Mason's jaw tightened. Harlow served under me during the war. A competent officer, but cruel. The men feared him. After the surrender, he followed me west uninvited and set himself up in town as a businessman. Loans mostly at rates that border on criminal. He and Victoria. Mason paused, seeming to search for words. They had a history. Before me. Nothing romantic, but complicated. He frightens Lily, Rebecca observed. More than fear, she was terrified. Yes, Mason agreed, though she's never indicated why. Some days I wonder if he was here that night, if he saw or did something. But there was only one set of footprints leading from the house. Rebecca considered this, thinking of the drawing she'd found the man with the knife, the woman in the snow. Could Lily have witnessed something? Something involving Harlow? If she did, she's never found a way to tell me. Mason ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and grief. I've tried, Miss Hayes. God knows I've tried to reach her to understand what happened. But Lily keeps her secrets locked inside and I'm left guessing at shadows. Rebecca thought of the child upstairs, of the silent burden she carried. Children who have witnessed trauma often find ways to communicate other than speech, she said. During the war, I worked with many such cases. Drawing in particular can be a window into their experiences. Lily draws constantly, Mason said. Mostly animals' landscapes. Occasionally people like the drawing she gave you yesterday. Rebecca hesitated, then reached into her pocket and withdrew the folded drawing she'd found her first night. She left this under my pillow, she said, placing it on the table between them. I think she wanted me to find it. Mason unfolded the paper, his face draining of color, as he took in the crude figures: the man with the knife, the woman in the snow, the other woman fleeing into the trees. His fingers traced the childish scrawl at the bottom. He made Mama sleep. This is what she saw, he whispered, his voice raw. This is what silenced her. A man with a knife, Rebecca confirmed, making her Mama sleep. But notice there are two women in the drawing, one lying in the snow, one running away. Mason looked up sharply. Two women, yes, and 3 sets of footprints according to Mrs. Hargrove, one coming back, 2 going away, or perhaps one going in, 2 going out. How do you know about Mrs. Hargrove? Mason's voice had hardened. Who have you been talking to? Rebecca realized her mistake too late. I haven't spoken to anyone, she said quickly. I merely assumed from what you said about the sheriff finding footprints. I said nothing about 3 sets of prints, Mason interrupted, or about Mrs. Hargrove. Who are you really, Miss Hayes, and what are you doing at my ranch? The question hung between them, demanding truth. Rebecca took a deep breath, knowing the moment had come to reveal at least part of her purpose. My name is Rebecca Hayes, she began. That much is true. I was a nurse during the war, and I am traveling to meet Theodore Palmer at Whispering Pines. But I am also looking for someone, a woman named Victoria Blackwood. Mason went still, his eyes never leaving her face. Why, because her sister asked me to find her. A young woman named Sophia, who believes her sister is in danger, or was 3 years ago, from a man named James Blackwood. James? Mason repeated. Not Mason. Yes, I assumed it was a coincidence, the name Blackwood, the ranch. But then you mentioned Victoria, and Lily's drawing showed 2 women, and I began to wonder. If I was using a false name, Mason's voice was dangerously quiet. If I was this James you're seeking, the thought occurred to me, Rebecca admitted. But I don't believe you are. James Blackwood was described to me as a cruel man who would hurt a woman without hesitation. You, she paused, choosing her words carefully. You carry guilt like a physical burden, Mr. Blackwood. That's not the mark of a man who hurts women willingly. Some of the tension left Mason's shoulders. Victoria had a sister, he said after a moment, Sophia, younger by several years. She visited us once, shortly after Lily was born. They were close, though they wrote rather than visited. Sophia lived back east in Boston, I believe. Did you know her well? Not really. She was shy, bookish. Didn't say much during her visit. Victoria mentioned once that Sophia had been ill as a child, something that affected her confidence, but they shared a deep bond, despite their differences. Rebecca nodded, piecing together the fragments of information. When was the last time you saw Sophia? Mason considered this. 5, perhaps 6 years ago. Well before, he gestured to the drawing, before whatever happened that night. And you've had no contact with her since Victoria's disappearance? None. I wrote to her parents' home in Missouri, informing them of Victoria's death. The letter was returned unopened. I assumed they had moved, or... He trailed off, leaving the alternative unspoken. Death, that constant companion on the frontier. Rebecca folded the drawing carefully and returned it to her pocket. Mr. Blackwood, I believe our paths crossing was not mere chance. I was sent to find Victoria Blackwood, and instead found you and Lily. There is a mystery here that connects to my promise to Sophia. What promise? To find Victoria and tell her that Sophia is safe. That he, presumably James Blackwood, would not find her where she had gone. Mason shook his head. You're chasing ghosts, Miss Hayes. Victoria is gone, and there is no James Blackwood in these parts, only me. Perhaps, Rebecca conceded, but I cannot leave until I'm certain. Too many coincidences, too many unanswered questions. She met his gaze steadily. Will you allow me to stay, to try to help Lily find her voice, and perhaps uncover the truth of what happened that night? Mason studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice held a weariness that went bone-deep. And your appointment at Whispering Pines, your intended marriage. Rebecca thought of Theodore Palmer, a man she had never met, waiting for a bride who might never arrive. Some promises must be broken to keep others, she said softly. I will write to Mr. Palmer and explain the circumstances or some version of them. He can find another bride through the agency. And if I refuse to let you stay, then I will go to Whispering Pines as planned, Rebecca said, though the words tasted like ash. But I will always wonder what became of Victoria and whether I could have helped Lily find her voice again. From upstairs came the soft padding of feet, Lily returning with her chosen book. Mason glanced toward the sound, then back at Rebecca. In his eyes, she saw conflict suspicion, but also a desperate hope that she might somehow reach the daughter he could not. You can stay, he said finally. For now, but understand this, Miss Hayes, I will protect my daughter at all costs. If I sense that your presence is causing her more harm than good, or if I discover you have been less than truthful with me, you will leave. Immediately and without argument. Rebecca nodded, accepting his terms. I understand, Mr. Blackwood, and thank you. Lily appeared in the doorway, a worn copy of fairy tales clutched to her chest. She looked from her father to Rebecca, sensing the gravity of their conversation. Mason managed a smile for his daughter. Miss Hayes will be staying with us a while longer, little one, he said gently. "Would you like that?" Lily's solemn face transformed a smile, breaking across it like sunrise over the mountains. She nodded vigorously, then crossed to Rebecca and placed the book in her lap, looking up expectantly. "I'd be happy to read to you," Rebecca said, her heart swelling at the child's obvious joy. "Shall we sit by the fire?" As they settled in the parlor, the fairy tale open between them, Rebecca was acutely aware of Mason watching from the doorway. His face was a study in contrasts, hope warring with suspicion, gratitude with doubt. Whatever had happened 3 years ago had left scars on father and daughter alike. And Rebecca, drawn into their wounded circle by fate or providence, found herself more determined than ever to uncover the truth about Victoria, about Sophia, about the man with the knife who had made Mama sleep, even if that truth proved more terrible than any of them could imagine. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm at Blackwood Ranch. Rebecca wrote to Theodore Palmer at Whispering Pines, explaining in carefully chosen words that unforeseen circumstances had delayed her arrival indefinitely. She also penned a brief note to the matrimonial agency, informing them of the change in her plans. Whether either letter would reach its destination through the winter mail service remained uncertain, but the act of writing them solidified her decision to stay. Mason maintained a wary distance, civil but guarded. He spent his days tending to the ranch, repairing fences damaged by the storm, checking on the cattle that had weathered the blizzard, preparing the barn for the approaching spring that still felt months away. At meals, he spoke little, answering Rebecca's questions with the minimum words necessary. Yet she often caught him watching her interactions with Lily, a complex emotion in his eyes that she couldn't quite decipher. Lily, in contrast, blossomed under Rebecca's attention. Though still silent, the child found numerous ways to communicate: nods, gestures, and, increasingly, drawings. Each morning, Rebecca would find a new sketch slipped under her door: birds, in-flight horses running, and occasionally the three of them together before the ranch house. Never again did Lily produce anything like the disturbing image of the man with the knife. But Rebecca remained watchful for any sign that the child was ready to reveal more about that night. A week after Griffin Harlowe's unwelcome visit, Rebecca woke in the deepest part of night to the sound of whispers. She lay perfectly still, straining to hear. The wind had died down, leaving the house in unusual silence, broken only by the faint murmur of a voice, too indistinct to identify. Slowly, Rebecca rose from bed and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. The wooden floor was cold beneath her bare feet as she moved to the door and eased it open just enough to peer into the darkened hallway. Nothing moved in the shadows, but the whispers continued coming, she realized, from downstairs. Keeping close to the wall where the floorboards were less likely to creak, Rebecca made her way to the top of the stairs and listened. A woman's voice, soft but urgent. "You shouldn't have let her stay. It's too dangerous." Then Mason's deeper tones, too low to make out the words clearly. The woman again. "You don't understand. If he finds out—" Rebecca leaned forward, straining to hear, but her weight caused the stair to creak beneath her. Instantly, silence fell below. Heart pounding, Rebecca retreated to the shadows as footsteps approached the bottom of the staircase. "Who's there?" Mason called, his voice tight with alarm. Rebecca considered pretending she hadn't heard, returning to her room and feigning sleep. But subterfuge had never been her nature. "It's just me," she said, stepping into view at the top of the stairs. "I heard voices." Mason stood at the foot of the staircase, a lamp in hand, casting his face in harsh relief. He was fully dressed despite the late hour, his expression a mixture of wariness and resignation. "Come down, Miss Hayes," he said after a moment. "There's someone you should meet." Rebecca descended the stairs slowly, acutely aware of her nightgown and loosened hair. In the parlor, A figure stood by the window, a woman slender and wrapped in a dark cloak, her face hidden in shadow. As Rebecca entered, the woman turned, lowering her hood to reveal a face that stole Rebecca's breath. She was beautiful with delicate features, and eyes the same stormy blue as Mason's and Lily's. But it was her hair that drew Rebecca's gaze, long and blonde, the exact shade of the single strand Rebecca had found in the hallway that night. Victoria. Rebecca breathed certain, despite never having seen the woman before. The woman's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with suspicion. "You know me." "I know of you," Rebecca corrected, aware of Mason watching the exchange intently. "Your sister sent me to find you." Victoria paled, one hand moving to her throat. "Sophia. You've seen Sophia." 6 months ago in St. Louis. "She gave me this." Rebecca hurried back upstairs to retrieve the embroidered handkerchief from her bag, returning to find Victoria and Mason in tense conversation that ceased the moment she reappeared. She handed the handkerchief to Victoria, who took it with trembling fingers. "For those who cannot fly home," she read aloud, tracing the embroidered dove. "This is Sophia's work. She always had a gift with a needle." Her eyes, suddenly bright with tears, lifted to Rebecca's face. "Is she well? Is she safe?" "She was when I saw her," Rebecca said, though frightened. "She asked me to find you, to tell you she was safe, and that he would not find her where she had gone." Victoria's gaze flicked to Mason, then back to Rebecca. "Did she mention James?" "Only the name. She said James Blackwood would not find her. I assumed—" She glanced at Mason. "I thought perhaps there was some relation." "My brother," Mason said grimly. "My half-brother, to be precise. Different mothers, same cruel father." Victoria sank into a chair, still clutching the handkerchief. In the lamplight, Rebecca noticed what the shadows had hidden: a thin scar along the woman's jawline, and the slight asymmetry to her features that spoke of a broken nose healed but not quite perfectly. "James was my first husband," Victoria said quietly. "A mistake I nearly paid for with my life." Rebecca took a seat across from her, aware that she was finally approaching the heart of the mystery that had drawn her to Blackwood Ranch. "Sophia didn't tell me much," she said, "only that you were in danger and that I should find you." Victoria's laugh held no humor. "Danger? Yes, I suppose that's one word for it." She looked up at Mason, who stood like a sentinel by the door. "Should I tell her?" "It's your story," he replied, "but she's here because of it. She deserves to know." Victoria nodded, took a deep breath, and began. "I met James Blackwood at a social in St. Louis shortly after the war. He was charming, wealthy, and attentive, everything a young woman is taught to desire in a husband. We married within 3 months, too quickly for anyone to warn me about his true nature." She paused, her fingers working the embroidered handkerchief. "The abuse began slowly. A harsh word here, a controlling demand there. By the time he first struck me, I was already isolated from family and friends. My parents had died in a fever epidemic, leaving only Sophia and me. James sent her away to school, claiming she was a distraction to our marriage." "How did you escape?" Rebecca asked gently. "Mason," Victoria said with a glance of such profound gratitude toward the man that Rebecca felt like an intruder witnessing it. "James's half-brother, who I'd never met during our courtship. He came to visit us in St. Louis, saw what was happening, and offered me sanctuary here in Montana. It took me 6 months to find the courage to leave." Mason's voice when he spoke carried the weight of old anger. "James nearly killed her the night she tried to go. Broke her nose, her ribs. Would have done worse if I hadn't arrived when I did." "We fled west," Victoria continued. Mason, myself, and Sophia, who had returned from school by then. James followed, of course. A man like that doesn't surrender what he considers his property. "So you came here to Blackwood Ranch," Rebecca said, pieces falling into place. "And you married Mason instead." Something passed between Victoria and Mason, a look laden with history and unspoken emotion. "Yes," Victoria said. "We married, not for love initially, but for protection. James couldn't touch me as Mason's wife, not legally. And in time we found happiness. Lily was born. We thought we were safe." "But you weren't," Rebecca guessed, thinking of the drawing, the man with the knife, the woman in the snow. "No," Victoria's voice had dropped to nearly a whisper. "James found us 3 years ago during a blizzard, much like the one that brought you here." Mason took up the narrative, his face grim in the lamplight. "I was away checking the herd. Victoria was alone with Lily when James arrived. By the time I returned, there had been violence." "What happened?" Rebecca asked, though she dreaded the answer. Victoria's hand moved unconsciously to her scarred jawline. "James had a knife. He said he'd come to reclaim what was his mart. When I refused, he attacked. There was a struggle. Sophia, who had been staying with us, tried to intervene. In the chaos, James was injured badly. We thought he was dead," Mason said flatly. "Victoria and Sophia dragged him out into the storm, into the woods. They thought they were disposing of a corpse. But he wasn't dead," Rebecca realized. "Griffin Harlow. He's James, isn't he? That's why Lily is so frightened of him." Victoria's head stood up, eyes wide with terror. "Harlow was here at the ranch a week ago," Mason confirmed. "Just checking on us after the storm or so," he claimed. "He saw me," Rebecca added, "spoke to Lily as well." Victoria stood abruptly, pacing the small parlor like a caged animal. "We have to leave. Now. Tonight. If he knows I'm alive—" "He doesn't," Mason cut in. "He suspects, perhaps, but he doesn't know. If he did, he would have made his move already." "Wait," Rebecca said, struggling to process the flood of revelations. "Griffin Harlow is James Blackwood, your brother Victoria's abusive first husband." "Yes and no," Mason replied. "Griffin Harlow is real, or was. A lieutenant who served under me during the war, killed at Chancellorsville. James assumed his identity after we believed him dead. New name, new face, thanks to the scar, but the same man underneath. He followed us west," Victoria explained. "Used his position as a war buddy of Mason's to integrate himself into the community. We didn't recognize him at first. The scar changed his appearance significantly, and we believed James dead in the woods. By the time we realized the truth, he had established himself in town as a respectable businessman. With friends in influential positions," Mason added grimly, "including the sheriff." Rebecca sat back, absorbing the tangled web of deception and violence. "And Lily, where does she fit into all this?" A shadow crossed Victoria's face. She saw everything. The attack, the struggle, James Griffin lying bleeding on the floor. Sophia and I dragging him into the snow. She hasn't spoken since that night. "And the story about Victoria's death?" Rebecca asked Mason. "The blood on your shirt. A fabrication, but a necessary one," he replied. "When we realized James had survived and assumed this new identity, we knew he would seek revenge. Victoria's death was our only protection for her, for Lily, for all of us. The blood was real James's blood on my clothes after I helped dispose of what we thought was his body." "But you've been here all along," Rebecca said to Victoria. "Hidden in your own home." Victoria shook her head. "Not always. I stay at the old hunting cabin in the North Woods most of the time. I only risk coming to the ranch when I'm certain Griffin James is elsewhere. Mason sends word when it's safe. She comes to see Lily, Mason explained. A child needs her mother. Rebecca thought of the blonde hair in the hallway, the shadowy figure she'd glimpsed. Not a dream or imagination, Victoria visiting her daughter in secret. Does Lily know that her mother is alive? Yes, Victoria said softly. She understands the need for secrecy even at her age. She knows that the bad man would hurt Mama if he found her. The man with the knife, Rebecca murmured, remembering the drawing. The man who made Mama sleep. Victoria looked confused. Sleep. Rebecca withdrew the folded drawing from her pocket, handing it to Victoria. Lily drew this. She left it for me to find. Victoria studied the crude image, her face softening. Oh, my sweet girl, she whispered. No, not sleep as in death. James Griffin struck me unconscious during the struggle. I collapsed in the snow outside when we were moving him. Lily must have seen from the window and thought. She trailed off, pain etched in every line of her face. For 3 years, she's believed she witnessed her mother's murder. Mason said, his voice rough with emotion. We tried to explain, but she was so young and the trauma. She retreated into silence. And the second woman in the drawing, Rebecca asked. Running into the trees. Sophia, Victoria confirmed. After we thought James dead, she fled east, fearing she would be blamed for his death. We arranged for her to travel with a family heading to Boston. I haven't seen her since that night. Rebecca's hand moved to the chain around her neck, where she kept the key to her trunk. Sophia didn't go to Boston, she said. She made it as far as St. Louis. That's where I met her, working as a seamstress in the same boarding house where I stayed after the war. She's still there. Victoria's voice trembled with hope. Truly. She was 6 months ago, Rebecca said, frightened, always looking over her shoulder, but alive and well. Tears spilled down Victoria's cheeks. All this time, I thought she might be dead. James Griffin made insinuations, cruel hints that he'd found her. I never knew what to believe. A tactic to keep you in fear, Mason said grimly. He's always enjoyed that power. A terrible thought occurred to Rebecca. If Griffin is really James, and he saw me here at the ranch, he must suspect I'm connected to Victoria or Sophia somehow. My arrival coincides too neatly with his visit. It's possible, Mason acknowledged, though he may simply see you as a potential target, a woman alone new to the area. Either way, you're in danger by association with us, Victoria said. You should leave, Miss Hayes. Continue to Whispering Pines as you planned. There's nothing for you here but peril. Rebecca thought of Lily, of the child's silent suffering, and the tentative trust she'd placed in a stranger. I disagree, she said firmly. There's a little girl who needs help finding her voice again. There's a family torn apart by violence and fear. And there's a promise I made to Sophia that I intend to keep. What promise? Victoria asked. To find you. To help you if I could. Rebecca met the other woman's gaze steadily. I'm not easily frightened, Mrs. Blackwood. I served in field hospitals during the war. I've seen humanity at its worst and its most courageous. I won't abandon Lily now, or you. Mason and Victoria exchanged glances, a silent communication born of years together. Finally, Mason spoke. It's your decision, Miss Hayes, but understand the risk you're taking. James Griffin is dangerous, and he has influence in these parts. I understand, Rebecca said, but I'm staying. The conversation might have continued, but a small sound from the stairs drew all eyes. Lily stood on the bottom step in her nightgown, eyes wide and fixed on her mother. "Lily," Victoria breathed, opening her arms. The child flew across the room into her mother's embrace, burying her face in Victoria's shoulder. Victoria held her daughter tightly, murmuring endearments into her hair, tears flowing freely now. Rebecca felt a lump form in her throat at the sight. Mason moved to stand beside her, his voice pitched low. "Now you understand why I couldn't tell you the truth from the beginning." "Yes," Rebecca replied softly, "though I wish you had trusted me sooner." "Trust is a luxury we haven't been able to afford," he said simply. "Not with James still out there watching, waiting." Rebecca watched as Victoria smoothed Lily's tangled hair, whispering reassurances. Despite the joy of their reunion, the shadow of fear never quite left Victoria's eyes, the hypervigilance of prey that knows the predator is still hunting. "He needs to be stopped," Rebecca said quietly, "permanently this time." Mason's gaze, when it met hers, held grim agreement. "Yes, but how he has the sheriff in his pocket, and half the town believes him a war hero and successful businessman. My word against his would mean little, especially with my history." "Your history, the drink," Mason said bluntly. "After the war, I found solace in whiskey. It's no secret in these parts. James Griffin has made sure of that, subtly undermining my credibility at every turn." "Then we need proof," Rebecca determined, "evidence of his true identity, of his crimes. If such proof exists, we haven't found it in 3 years of searching." The conversation paused as Victoria approached Lily's hand in hers. "She should be in bed," Victoria said, though she made no move to separate from her daughter. "Dawn will come too soon." "Stay tonight," Mason said. "Harlow left for Helena yesterday on business. He won't return for at least 3 days." Victoria hesitated, clearly torn between the desire to remain with her family and the fear that had governed her life for 3 years. "It's not safe," she said finally, "for any of us." "One night," Mason insisted. "Lily needs you." The unspoken addition, "I need you," hung in the air between them. After a moment, Victoria nodded. "Until dawn," she conceded. "Then I must return to the cabin." As the reunited family moved upstairs, Rebecca remained in the parlor, her mind racing with all she had learned. The mystery had unraveled, revealing a tale more tragic and complex than she had imagined. James Blackwood, now Griffin Harlow, a monster wearing a respectable mask. Victoria alive, but living as a ghost in her own life. Lily silenced by trauma, caught between parents who loved her but could not give her a normal childhood. And at the center, Mason, a man carrying the weight of it all, trying to protect his family, while haunted by his failure to prevent their suffering in the first place. Rebecca moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit snow. Somewhere in town, James Blackwood slept under another man's name, perhaps dreaming of the revenge he still sought. What would he do if he discovered Victoria alive? If he learned of Rebecca's connection to Sophia? She shivered, not from the cold. The danger was real, immediate. The sensible course would be to leave, as Victoria suggested, continue to Whispering Pines, marry Theodore Palmer as planned, and build a quiet life far from the shadow of the Blackwoods tragedy. But as Rebecca watched her breath fog the glass, she knew she would not take the sensible course. She had run once before from the memories of war, from the doctor's verdict that she would never bear children, from the pitying glances of former suitors. She would not run again, not from this fight. Dawn would bring difficult decisions and dangerous paths. But for tonight, a family was whole again under this roof. It would have to be enough. Morning arrived with pale sunlight struggling through heavy clouds. Another storm approaching, though not yet upon them. Rebecca woke to the unfamiliar sound of laughter downstairs. Lily's high, childish giggle paired with Victoria's warmer tones. For a moment, she lay still, savoring the knowledge that for these few precious hours, the Blackwood family had found a measure of peace. She dressed quickly in her plainest dress, suitable for the plan forming in her mind. If they needed evidence of Griffin Harlowe's true identity, she would have to venture into town, make inquiries, perhaps find witnesses who remembered James Blackwood's arrival in the area. Downstairs, the scene in the kitchen struck Rebecca with its simple domesticity. Victoria stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with practiced ease, while Lily sat at the table, a genuine smile lighting her small face. Mason leaned against the doorframe, watching his wife and daughter with undisguised longing, a man glimpsing paradise while knowing it could not last. "Good morning," Rebecca said, hesitant to intrude on the family moment. 3 pairs of eyes turned to her, Lily's bright with happiness, Victoria's guarded but grateful, Mason's reflecting the same wariness that had marked their earliest interactions. "Miss Hayes," Victoria greeted her, "I hope you slept well despite our midnight revelations." "Better than expected," Rebecca replied, accepting the cup of coffee Mason offered. "And please call me Rebecca." Victoria nodded, turning back to her cooking. "Rebecca, then. We owe you an explanation about last night." "You owe me nothing," Rebecca assured her, taking a seat at the table. "I'm the intruder here, not you." "Nevertheless," Victoria said, placing a plate of pancakes on the table, "you're involved now through no fault of your own. You deserve to know exactly what you've stepped into." Over breakfast with Lily, occupied by a piece of paper, and her charcoal, Victoria filled in the gaps of her story. She had met James Blackwood at 19, orphaned and responsible for her 16-year-old sister, Sophia. James had seemed a godsend, wealthy, charming, promising security for both sisters. The reality of marriage had been a cruel awakening. He was careful at first, Victoria explained, her voice steady despite the painful recollections. The bruises where they wouldn't show, the isolation from friends, the constant belittling wearing down my confidence until I believed I deserved his treatment. Mason's jaw tightened, his hand clenching around his coffee cup. "Classic tactics of such men," he said darkly. "I saw the same in my father." Victoria reached across the table, her fingers briefly touching his in silent understanding. "Mason's arrival was providence," she continued. "He came to St. Louis on business, having had little contact with his half-brother for years. One look at my condition, and he knew exactly what was happening." "James always did take after our father," Mason said grimly. "The old man beat his first wife, my mother, to death. The law called it an accident. I was 7 years old." Rebecca felt a chill at his words, understanding better now the demons that drove him. "So you helped Victoria escape?" "I offered sanctuary here at the ranch," Mason confirmed. "It was newly established, then remote enough to provide safety. But I underestimated James's obsession. When Victoria fled, taking Sophia with her, he followed. It took him 2 years to find us," Victoria added. 2 years of peace in which Mason and I built something real, from what began as a marriage of convenience. Lily was born. We were happy. "Then James arrived," Rebecca prompted gently. Victoria nodded, her eyes straying to her daughter, still absorbed in her drawing. "During a blizzard when Mason was checking the herd. He came to the door smiling as if it were a social call. I tried to shut him out, but—" She touched the scar along her jawline. "He had a knife. Said he'd come to reclaim his wife and punish those who had stolen her. Sophia was here, Rebecca asked. Yes, visiting for Christmas. When she heard the commotion, she came downstairs. James hadn't expected her. I think her presence disrupted whatever plan he had formed. There was a struggle. The knife. Victoria swallowed hard. Sophia managed to stab him with his own blade. He fell bleeding heavily. We thought he was dead. We panicked, she continued after a moment. Dragged him out into the storm, into the woods, left him there buried in snow. Sophia was hysterical, convinced she'd be hanged for murder. I persuaded her to flee east while I stayed to protect Lily. And then, Rebecca prompted. 3 days later, Griffin Harlow arrived in town, Mason said, taking up the narrative. A stranger with a dramatic story about being attacked by bandits who left him for dead in the snow. His face was bandaged, the wounds still fresh. No one connected him to James Blackwood. Why would they? The physical resemblance was hidden by the injuries, and James had never visited the town during his previous trip to the ranch. He established himself quickly, Victoria added. Used money. James always had money, though God knows how he came by it to open a lending business. Made himself indispensable to local ranchers struggling after harsh winters. Cultivated friendships with influential citizens, including the sheriff. Meanwhile, we believed the secret safe, Mason said. Victoria hidden away, Sophia gone east, James presumably dead. It wasn't until Griffin came to call at the ranch, ostensibly as my former lieutenant, that we began to suspect. Little things, the way he looked at Lily, comments about Victoria that no stranger should have known to make. By then it was too late, Victoria said. He had the town's respect, and we had no proof, just suspicions, and a child who had witnessed everything but couldn't speak of it. Rebecca absorbed this, her mind working through the implications. And now, what's his aim? Revenge, Mason said simply. He believes Victoria dead, and Sophia fled. He stays close, watching me, watching Lily, perhaps hoping Sophia will return, or that I'll lead him to her. Or perhaps he knows more than we realize, Victoria added, her voice dropping. Sometimes I think he suspects I'm alive, that he's merely toying with us, enjoying our fear. Rebecca thought of Griffin's visit to the ranch, his pointed comments about life going on, despite unpleasantness. Had those been the words of a man who suspected, or one who knew with certainty, there's one person who might know more than she's told? Rebecca said, an idea forming. Mrs. Lenora Winters. You mentioned her yesterday, Mason, when we spoke of footprints in the snow. Mason frowned. Lenora? The widow who lives by the creek. What would she know of this? I don't know, Rebecca admitted. But you said the sheriff found footprints leading from the house that night. Mrs. Winters's cabin overlooks the path to the woods. If she was awake during the storm, she might have seen something, Victoria and Sophia dragging James into the forest, perhaps. Or James Griffin returning later. Victoria and Mason exchanged glances. It's possible, Victoria conceded. Lenora's cabin sits on the ridge above the North Trail, and she's known for keeping odd hours insomnia, she claims. I should speak with her, Rebecca decided. As a newcomer, I could make inquiries without raising suspicion. A social call, nothing more. It's too risky, Mason objected. If Griffin has eyes in town, word of your interest in old events could get back to him. Not if I'm careful, Rebecca countered. Besides, what choice do we have? We need evidence of his true identity, something concrete the law can't ignore. Victoria studied Rebecca thoughtfully. You're determined to help us, she said. Why, you could leave today, continue to Whispering Pines, build a new life free from this danger. Rebecca's gaze moved to Lily, still bent over her drawing. Because some wrongs can't be walked away from, she said quietly. And because I made a promise to your sister. A promise that had become so much more, though Rebecca kept that thought to herself. In the week she had spent at Blackwood Ranch, she had grown attached to Lily, admiring of Victoria's courage, and increasingly drawn to Mason despite his gruff exterior. These people had survived unimaginable trauma, had fought to protect each other against a monster wearing a respectable face. How could she abandon them now? I'll go today, she decided. Griffin is in Helena, you said. This may be our best opportunity. Mason still looked unconvinced but nodded reluctantly. I'll drive you part way, he said. Not all the way to her cabin that would draw attention, but close enough to shorten your walk. Thank you, Rebecca said. I'll need a reason for calling on her. Does she sell anything, eggs, perhaps, or handicrafts? Herbal remedies, Victoria supplied. Teas and tinctures for various ailments. She was a midwife in her younger days. Perfect, Rebecca said. I'll claim interest in her remedies for female complaints, perhaps. Personal enough that no one would question further. The plan settled, Rebecca helped Victoria clear the breakfast dishes while Mason went to prepare the wagon. Lily, having finished her drawing, presented it proudly to Rebecca, a picture of a woman with red gold hair like Rebecca's, holding the hands of a smaller figure with a braid. Is this us, Lily? Rebecca asked, smiling at the child's nod. It's beautiful, thank you. Victoria watched the exchange, her expression softening. She's drawn to you, she said quietly once Lily had gone to help her father. More than I've seen her respond to anyone since that night. Children often connect with those who see them clearly, Rebecca replied. And Lily has much to say, even without words. You understand trauma, Victoria observed. From your work as a nurse? Partly, Rebecca acknowledged, and partly from personal experience. Her hand moved unconsciously to her side, where beneath her dress lay the twisted scar. Victoria noticed the gesture. You were injured during the war. A field hospital explosion, Rebecca confirmed. Confederate artillery, though I don't believe they were aiming for us specifically. Just bad luck being in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Yet you survived, Victoria said. As did I. Perhaps that's why Lily trusts you. She recognizes a fellow survivor. The observation struck Rebecca with its simple truth. She had never considered herself particularly strong or brave, merely lucky, perhaps, to have lived when so many others died. But surviving had required a kind of stubborn resilience, a refusal to surrender to despair, even when the future seemed bleak. The same quality she recognized in Victoria in Mason, and increasingly in Lily. We should go, Mason called from the doorway. If you still intend to make this visit. Rebecca nodded, retrieving her cloak and gloves. Victoria helped her with the heavy garment, her hands lingering briefly on Rebecca's shoulders. Be careful, she warned. Lenora sees much, but shares selectively. She has no love for the law in these parts. Too many memories of her husband's mistreatment at their hands, but neither is she an easy ally. I'll tread carefully, Rebecca promised, and I'll return before dark. The journey to Mrs. Winters's cabin took the better part of an hour, even with Mason driving the wagon as far as he dared. The day had turned colder, the promised storm gathering on the horizon, dark clouds massing over the distant mountains. I don't like this, Mason said as Rebecca prepared to continue on foot. The weather's turning, and Lenora isn't known for hospitality to strangers. All the more reason to hurry, Rebecca replied, adjusting her cloak against the rising wind. I'll be fine, Mr. Blackwood. I've weathered worse than a cranky widow and some snow. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I believe you have, he conceded. Still don't linger. I'll wait here 2 hours no longer. If you haven't returned by then, I'll come looking for you." Rebecca nodded oddly, touched by his concern. 2 hours should be ample time for a social call. I'll return well before then. The path to Mrs. Winters's cabin wound through a stand of pines, before emerging onto a small ridge overlooking the valley. From this vantage point, Rebecca could see Blackwood Ranch in the distance, smoke curling from its chimney into the heavy sky. To the north, the forest thickened, concealing the hunting cabin where Victoria had spent 3 years in hiding. And to the east, barely visible on the horizon, lay the town of White Ridge, where Griffin Harlow James Blackwood had established his new identity. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, built of logs, darkened by age and weather. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the stone chimney, suggesting the occupant was at home. Rebecca approached the door, rehearsing her story one last time, and knocked firmly. For a long moment, nothing happened. She was about to knock again when the door creaked open just enough to reveal a single sharp eye regarding her suspiciously. "What do you want?" The voice was female, rough with age and disuse. Rebecca summoned her most pleasant smile. "Good day, Mrs. Winters. My name is Rebecca Hayes. I'm staying at Blackwood Ranch, and heard you might sell herbal remedies. I was hoping to purchase some for women's difficulties." The eye narrowed, assessing her from head to toe. "Blackwood sent you?" "No, ma'am. I came on my own initiative, though Mr. Blackwood was kind enough to drive me part way." After a moment's consideration, the door opened wider, revealing a woman of indeterminate age, somewhere between 60 and eternity, Rebecca guessed. She was small and wiry, with a face as weathered as the cabin itself, creased with deep lines that spoke of hard years. A long scar traversed the side of her neck, disappearing beneath the collar of her dress. "Come in, then," Mrs. Winters said grudgingly. "Storm's brewing. Might as well wait it out here." Rebecca stepped into the cabin, grateful for the warmth after the increasingly bitter wind outside. The interior was a single room, a bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs in another, and a fireplace dominating the wall opposite the door. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with a complex blend of scents, both pleasant and medicinal. "Sit," Mrs. Winters instructed, gesturing to one of the chairs. "What exactly ails you? Monthly's barrenness, feminine melancholy." Rebecca chose her words carefully. "An old injury that sometimes pains me," she said, which was true enough. "I was told your teas might help." The old woman grunted, moving to a shelf lined with glass jars filled with various dried plants. "War injury was it, field nurse, by your hands?" She glanced back at Rebecca's startled expression. "These eyes may be old, but they see clear enough. You've the look of someone who's tended the dying." "Yes," Rebecca admitted, reassessing the widow. "I served with the Union forces. Husband in the cavalry," Mrs. Winters said, selecting several jars. "Killed at Shiloh. Left me nothing but memories and this cabin." She began measuring herbs into a small cloth bag. "So, Blackwood Ranch. You're not his wife, that one's long gone. Not his sister, wrong coloring. What are you to Mason Blackwood?" The directness of the question caught Rebecca off guard. "A guest," she said. "Temporarily." Mrs. Winters snorted. "Mason Blackwood doesn't take guests, especially not unmarried women with educated speech and city clothes." Rebecca decided to risk a partial truth. "I was bound for Whispering Pines Ranch," she explained. "The storm diverted me to Blackwoods. I've stayed on to help with his daughter." The mute child, Mrs. Winters nodded. "Poor little thing. Hasn't spoken since her mama vanished." "Vanished?" Rebecca echoed, seizing the opening. "I understood Mrs. Blackwood had died." The old woman's hands paused in their work, her sharp eyes finding Rebecca's. "That's the story," she agreed. Not sure it's the truth. What do you mean? Mrs. Winters resumed her measuring, dropping dried leaves into the cloth bag with practiced precision. Night Victoria Blackwood supposedly died, I was awake. Insomnia my curse since Samuel passed. I sit by that window most nights. She nodded toward a small window that faced in the direction of the ranch. I see things. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. What did you see? That night, Mrs. Winters, 3 people leaving the Blackwood house, the widow said bluntly. 2 women dragging something heavy between them, man-sized wrapped in a blanket. They took it into the woods, came back without it, maybe an hour later. Then one of the women, the younger one, she took a horse and rode east. The other went back to the house. And after that, Rebecca prompted gently. Mrs. Winters tied the cloth bag with a piece of twine, her gnarled fingers working deftly despite their arthritis. Later that same night, a man came out of those woods, stumbling, falling, blood on the snow behind him. He made it as far as the road before collapsing. Did you help him? The old woman's laugh was harsh, like stones rattling in a bucket. Help a stranger in the dead of night with a storm howling. I may be a healer, girl, but I'm not a fool. Besides, she touched the scar on her neck. I learned young not to trust men who bleed in the darkness. What happened to him? Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer. Stage found him next morning nearly frozen, took him to town. Few days later, talk was all about the new man in White Ridge Griffin Harlow, survivor of a bandit attack. Mrs. Winters handed Rebecca the cloth bag. Steep this in hot water for 10 minutes. Drink before bed. Rebecca accepted the remedy, her mind racing with the implications of Mrs. Winters's account. Here was an eyewitness who had seen James Griffin emerge from the very woods where Victoria and Sophia had left him for dead. Someone who had observed the entire sequence of events from the disposal of what they thought was a corpse to the miraculous survivor staggering to the road. Mrs. Winters, she said carefully, have you ever told anyone else what you saw that night? The widow's expression hardened. Sheriff came asking questions when Victoria Blackwood was reported missing. I told him nothing. Man's in Harlow's pocket has been since the beginning. Whatever happened at that ranch that night, Law wouldn't have cared to hear the truth of it. And Mason Blackwood, does he know what you saw? Never asked, Mrs. Winters replied. Man was deep in the bottle after his wife died. By the time he sobered up, the story was set in stone. Victoria gone, little girl silent, and a new man in town with a scarred face and money to lend. Rebecca considered her next words carefully. What if I told you Victoria Blackwood isn't dead? The old woman's eyes narrowed, but she didn't look particularly surprised. Wouldn't be the first wife to fake her death to escape a bad situation, she said after a moment. Though in my experience, they usually leave the children behind. Takes a powerful reason for a mother to live as a ghost in her own child's life. A very powerful reason, Rebecca agreed. One named James Blackwood. Mrs. Winters went still, her weathered face suddenly alert. James Blackwood, she repeated. Victoria's first husband from back east. Mean bastard by all accounts. Yes, Rebecca confirmed, surprised at the widow's knowledge. You knew of him. Heard Victoria mention the name once, years back, Mrs. Winters said. She'd bring Lily to me when the child had croup. Sometimes mothers talk when they're worried for their little ones. Let slip things they otherwise keep hidden. James Blackwood and Griffin Harlow are the same man, Rebecca said bluntly, deciding to trust the widow's obvious distaste for the law and for Harlow. The corpse Victoria and her sister dragged into the woods was James stabbed in self-defense. They thought him dead. He survived, returned with a new face and name, and has been terrorizing them ever since. For a long moment, Mrs. Winters said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then she moved to a trunk in the corner, unlocked it with a key she wore around her neck, and withdrew a small leather-bound book. "I keep a journal," she explained, returning to the table. "Old habit from when Samuel was alive. He'd go missing for days, drinking and gambling. I'd write down when he left, when he returned, what condition he was in. Helped me track the pattern, prepare for the worst times." She opened the book to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "After Victoria vanished, I started noting Griffin Harlow's movements. Something about him set my teeth on edge, reminded me too much of Samuel in his darkest moods. Here." She pushed the journal toward Rebecca. "Dates, times, observations. 3 years' worth." Rebecca scanned the meticulous entries, amazement growing with each page. Mrs. Winters had documented Griffin's comings and goings, with obsessive detail: his visits to the Blackwood Ranch, his business trips to Helena, and beyond, the names of those who called at his office in town. Most tellingly, she had noted the correlation between Griffin's absences and the rare occasions when smoke rose from the chimney of the old hunting cabin in the North Woods. "You knew," Rebecca realized. "You knew Victoria was hiding there." "Suspected," Mrs. Winters corrected. "Never saw her myself. But the cabin was abandoned years ago. Someone was using it. Someone who only came and went when Harlow was away from Whiteridge." "Why didn't you tell Mason?" The widow's mouth tightened. "Man was drowning himself in whiskey most days. By the time he sobered up, I wasn't sure what was safer for Victoria, him knowing or not knowing. Besides, Harlow watches the ranch. If Mason had started visiting that cabin, how long before Harlow followed?" Rebecca couldn't argue with the logic. "This journal," she said, tapping the leather cover. "It's evidence, patterns, dates, observations that link Griffin Harlow to the night James Blackwood supposedly died. Would you be willing to share it, to help prove his true identity?" Mrs. Winters considered the request, her sharp eyes studying Rebecca's face. "You care for them," she said abruptly. "The Blackwoods. Not just the child, but the man, too. I can see it plain as day." Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks, but didn't deny the observation. "They've suffered greatly," she said instead. "They deserve justice and peace." "Justice is rare in these parts," Mrs. Winters said cynically, "and peace rarer still for women who defy men like James Blackwood." She sighed, pushing the journal closer to Rebecca. "Take it. Use it how you will. I've written down what I've seen for 3 years, never thinking anyone would believe an old widow with a scarred neck and no standing in the community." "Thank you," Rebecca said carefully, tucking the journal into her cloak. "This could make all the difference. Perhaps," Mrs. Winters allowed, "or perhaps you're all doomed regardless. Men like Blackwood or Harlow, whatever name he wears, don't surrender their prey easily, and they don't forgive those who defy them." The ominous words hung in the air, punctuated by a sudden gust of wind that rattled the cabin's windows. Outside, snow had begun to fall, fat, heavy flakes that would soon obscure the path back to where Mason waited. "I should go," Rebecca said, rising from her chair, "before the storm worsens." Mrs. Winters nodded, moving to the door. "Take care on the path," she warned, "and watch your back in town. Harlow has eyes everywhere, paid informants who report any stranger asking questions." "I'll be careful," Rebecca promised, securing her cloak against the rising wind. "Thank you again for the remedy and the information." The old woman's hand shot out suddenly, gripping Rebecca's arm with surprising strength. "One more thing," she said, her voice low and urgent. 3 days ago, Harlow received a visitor. A man I didn't recognize, not from these parts. They spoke for hours, and when the stranger left, Harlow seemed agitated, paced his office like a caged animal. Next morning, he left for Helena earlier than planned. You think the visitor brought news that upset him? I think, Mrs. Winters said deliberately, that predators are most dangerous when their territory is threatened. Whatever that stranger told Harlow, it set something in motion. Be wary, Miss Hayes. The game may be changing. With that cryptic warning, she released Rebecca's arm and stepped back into her cabin, closing the door firmly against the worsening weather. Rebecca stood for a moment on the narrow porch, absorbing the widow's words. A stranger visiting Griffin, bringing news that disturbed him enough to alter his plans. Could it be related to Sophia? Had James somehow discovered she was alive? Perhaps even learned of her location in St. Louis? The thought sent a chill through Rebecca that had nothing to do with the falling snow. If Griffin James knew about Sophia, he might also know about Rebecca's connection to her. Her arrival at Blackwood Ranch might not have been the coincidence she'd claimed, but a carefully orchestrated encounter, which meant Griffin's visit, his pointed interest in her, had been no casual inquiry, but a calculated assessment. He knew who she was, why she had come to Montana. And if he knew that much, how long before he discovered Victoria was alive? The storm was intensifying visibility, already reduced to a few yards ahead. Rebecca pulled her cloak tighter and began the treacherous descent from the ridge. Mrs. Winters's journal secure against her chest, her mind filled with new dangers and darker possibilities. Mason would be waiting, growing anxious as the weather worsened. And at the ranch, Victoria and Lily remained vulnerable, their brief reunion soon to end, as Victoria retreated once more to her solitary exile in the hunting cabin. They needed a plan, not just evidence of Griffin's true identity, but a strategy to use that evidence effectively. The journal alone wouldn't be enough, not with the local sheriff in Griffin's pocket. They would need to reach higher authorities, perhaps the federal marshal in Helena, someone beyond Griffin's influence. But first, Rebecca had to reach Mason and return safely to the ranch. One step at a time, she reminded herself, as she carefully picked her way down the snow-covered path. Survive this storm, then plan the next move. The wind howled through the pines, driving snow into blinding swirls that disoriented and confused. Rebecca kept her head down, following the barely visible track, conscious that a misstep on this ridge could mean a dangerous fall. So focused was she on the path that she nearly collided with the figure that suddenly materialized before her, a man on horseback emerging from the curtain of snow like an apparition. Rebecca stopped short, heart hammering in her chest. For one terrible moment, she thought Griffin Harlow had returned early from Helena, had somehow discovered her mission to Mrs. Winters. Then the rider pushed back his snow-covered hat, revealing Mason's worried face. "Miss Hayes," he called over the wind. "Thank God. I was coming to find you." Relief washed over Rebecca, her knees weak with it. "Mr. Blackwood," she acknowledged. "You're earlier than expected." "Storm's moving in faster than I anticipated," he explained, dismounting to stand beside her. "We need to get back to the ranch before it hits full force." His eyes took in her expression, narrowing slightly. "You found something?" "Yes," Rebecca confirmed, patting the journal beneath her cloak. "Mrs. Winters has been keeping records, detailed observations of Griffin's movements for 3 years. And she saw him the night he was supposedly attacked by bandits, saw him emerge from the very woods where Victoria and Sophia left him." Mason's face registered shock, then cautious hope. "She's willing to testify to this." "I don't know about testify, but she gave me her journal. It's evidence, Mason. Real evidence linking Griffin Harlow to James Blackwood." He noted her use of his given name but didn't comment on it. "We should go," he said instead, helping her mount the horse. "Victoria will be worried, and the storm is worsening by the minute." Rebecca settled in the saddle, Mason mounting behind her, his arms reaching around to take the reins. The closeness was improper, even scandalous by Eastern standards, but necessary given the conditions and the single horse. As they rode carefully down the ridge toward the waiting wagon, Rebecca felt the solid strength of Mason at her back, a bulwark against the howling wind and stinging snow. Despite the danger that still threatened them all, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, she found herself drawing comfort from his presence. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Mason, Victoria, Lily, and herself. An unlikely alliance formed by circumstance, bound by shared purpose and growing affection. The journal pressed against her heart. Its secrets, perhaps the key to their salvation. Or as Mrs. Winters had ominously suggested, merely the next move in a deadly game whose rules they did not fully understand. The blizzard hit with full force before Rebecca and Mason reached the ranch. Snow fell in blinding sheets, driven by a wind that cut through their clothing like knives of ice. The horse struggled against the gale, head lowered each step laborious through deepening drifts. "We won't make it to the ranch," Mason shouted over the howling wind. "The hunting cabin is closer. We'll shelter there until the storm passes." Rebecca nodded, too cold to argue. Her fingers had gone numb despite her gloves, and ice crystals formed on her eyelashes. The hunting cabin, Victoria's sanctuary for 3 years, was their only hope in this white fury. Mason guided the horse with the confidence of a man who knew this land intimately, even when landmarks disappeared beneath snow. They moved deeper into the forest, where the dense pines provided some shelter from the worst of the wind. After what seemed like hours, but was perhaps only 30 minutes, a small structure emerged from the whiteness, a one-room cabin built of logs nearly invisible against the wooded backdrop. "Here," Mason said, reining in the horse beside a crude lean-to that served as a stable. He dismounted quickly, then reached up to help Rebecca from the saddle. Her legs nearly buckled as her feet touched the ground. Mason caught her arm, steadying her. "Almost there," he encouraged, leading the horse under the shelter before guiding Rebecca to the cabin door. Inside, the air was cold, but still a blessed relief from the punishing wind. Mason moved with practiced efficiency, kneeling before the small stone fireplace, where ashes from a recent fire still lingered. Within minutes, he had coaxed flames from kindling and logs stacked nearby. As warmth gradually filled the small space, Rebecca took stock of her surroundings. The cabin was Spartan, but surprisingly homey. A narrow bed in one corner covered with patchwork quilts, a small table with 2 chairs, shelves holding books and essential supplies. A woman's touch was evident in the small details: dried wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill, a handmade rag rug on the plank floor, a child's drawing pinned to the wall. "Victoria's home," Rebecca said softly, understanding dawning. "For 3 years." Mason nodded, his face solemn in the flickering firelight. "Such as it is. She comes here when Griffin is in town, returns to the woods when he's away, where she can watch the ranch from a distance, see Lily playing in the yard." Rebecca's heart ached at the image, a mother reduced to observing her child from afar, stealing moments of normalcy in the brief periods when her tormentor was absent. "She'll be worried," Rebecca realized, "when we don't return to the ranch." "She'll know where we've gone," Mason assured her. "It's our contingency plan in bad weather. She'd have headed back here as soon as the storm threatened." He moved to the window, peering through the glass, now frosted with ice. "She may have been caught at the ranch, though, in which case she and Lily are safely waiting out the storm together." The thought brought Rebecca comfort, though it raised a new concern. But if Griffin returns early from Helena and finds Victoria at the ranch, "He won't," Mason said with more confidence than he likely felt. "Not in this weather. The passes between here and Helena would be the first to close. He's trapped there until the storm breaks, same as we're trapped here." Rebecca removed her snow-covered cloak and gloves, hanging them near the fire to dry. The warmth was beginning to return to her extremities, bringing with it the painful tingles of restored circulation. She took Mrs. Winters's journal from her cloak pocket, relieved to find it relatively unscathed by the journey. "We should examine this," she said, placing the leather-bound volume on the table. "See what Mrs. Winters has documented." Mason nodded, moving to stand beside her as she opened the journal. The widow's handwriting was precise and small, each entry dated and organized with military efficiency. The earliest entries began shortly after Victoria's death, noting Griffin's arrival in town, his establishment of the lending business, his cultivation of relationships with key figures, including the sheriff. As the months progressed, Mrs. Winters had recorded Griffin's frequent visits to Blackwood Ranch, ostensibly to check on his former commanding officer, but always when Mason was at his lowest, deep in drink, barely functioning. The pattern was clear, even from these dispassionate notes, Griffin systematically exploiting Mason's grief and guilt, perhaps hoping to extract some confession or clue to Victoria and Sophia's actions that night. More telling were the correlations Mrs. Winters had drawn between Griffin's business trips and the brief periods when the hunting cabin showed signs of occupation smoke from the chimney. A feminine figure glimpsed at the window, laundry, briefly appearing on a line only to vanish hours later. She knew, Mason said, wonder in his voice. All this time she knew Victoria was alive and hiding here. "Suspected at least," Rebecca confirmed. "She's remarkably observant for a woman supposedly isolated from community affairs." They continued through the journal, finding entries that documented Griffin's meetings with strangers from out-of-town, potential searchers hired to locate Sophia. Rebecca guessed. One name appeared repeatedly over the past year: Pinkerton, the famous detective agency known for tracking people across state lines. "He's been looking for Sophia," Rebecca said, pointing to the entry. "Hired professionals to find her." Mason's expression darkened. "If he's employing Pinkertons, he must have some idea where to look. They don't come cheap." Rebecca remembered Mrs. Winters's warning about the stranger who had visited Griffin days ago, the meeting that had left him agitated. "Mrs. Winters mentioned a visitor Griffin received recently," she said. "Someone who upset him enough to change his plans. What if it was one of these detectives? What if they found Sophia in St. Louis?" The possibility hung between them, ominous in its implications. If Griffin had discovered Sophia's location, he might also know of Rebecca's connection to her, might have deliberately allowed Rebecca to reach Blackwood Ranch, using her as an unwitting means of confirming Victoria's survival. "We need to warn Victoria," Rebecca decided, "and Sophia, if there's any way to get a message to St. Louis." "First, we need to survive this storm," Mason reminded her, moving to add another log to the fire. "Then we can plan our next steps." Rebecca closed the journal, her mind racing with possibilities and dangers. Outside, the blizzard continued, unabated snow piling against the windows, wind finding every crack and crevice in the cabin's construction. They were effectively trapped, whether for hours or days remained to be seen. "You should rest," Mason suggested, nodding toward the narrow bed. "It's been a difficult day, and the cold takes a toll." Rebecca shook her head. "I'm fine. We should use this time to formulate a plan. If Griffin knows about Sophia, if he suspects Victoria is alive—" "Rebecca," Mason interrupted gently. "We can plan, yes. But not if exhaustion clouds our judgment. Take a few hours. I'll keep watch." The use of her given name, rare from his lips, caught her attention. She studied his face in the firelight, the lines of worry etched around his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw, that couldn't quite mask his concern. For his family, yes, but also, she realized, with a small shock for her. "Very well," she conceded. "A short rest. Then we plan." She moved to the bed, settling atop the quilts rather than beneath them, a concession to propriety in their forced proximity. Mason took a seat at the table. The journal open before him, his profile outlined in gold by the flickering fire. Despite her intention to rest only briefly, exhaustion claimed Rebecca swiftly. Her last conscious thought was of Victoria, hopefully safe at the ranch, with Lily unaware that the fragile security of their arrangement might already be compromised. Rebecca woke to the sound of voices hushed urgent nearby. For a moment, she remained motionless, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings and the dim light filtering through ice-crusted windows. "Can't know for certain," Mason was saying, his voice low. "The journal suggests it, but—" "It's more than suggestion," a woman replied, Victoria. Rebecca realized. Griffin wouldn't have left for Helena so abruptly unless he had solid information. The timing is too perfect. Rebecca sat up, drawing their attention. Victoria stood near the fire snow, still melting from her cloak, her face pale with cold and fear. Mason sat at the table, Mrs. Winters's journal open between them. "You made it through the storm," Rebecca said, relief evident in her voice. Victoria nodded. "Barely. I left the ranch as soon as I saw the weather turning. Didn't want to risk being trapped there if Griffin returned unexpectedly." Her gaze moved to the journal. "Mason tells me you found evidence Lenora Winters has been documenting Griffin's activities." "Yes," Rebecca confirmed, rising to join them at the table. "And there's more. Mrs. Winters believes Griffin received news recently, something that disturbed him greatly. She thinks it might be connected to the Pinkerton detectives he's apparently hired." Victoria's face drained of what little color remained. "Sophia," she whispered. "He's found Sophia." "We don't know that for certain," Mason cautioned, placing a hand over hers. "But we need to consider the possibility." "If he's found her, she's in terrible danger," Victoria said, anguish clear in her voice. "James Griffin, he'll never forgive what happened that night. He'll kill her if he finds her and make sure her body is never discovered." "Unless finding her is merely a means to an end," Rebecca suggested. "A way to lure you out of hiding." Victoria's eyes, so like her daughter's, in their striking blue, met Rebecca's. "You think he knows I'm alive?" "I think he suspects," Rebecca said carefully. "His comments during his visit to the ranch, the attention he paid to me, a stranger with connections to the East, suggest he's been watching for someone like me. Someone who might lead him to you or Sophia." "Which means we're all in danger," Mason concluded grimly. "If Griffin believes Victoria is alive and in hiding, he won't rest until he confirms it. And if he's found Sophia, he may use her as leverage to draw Victoria out." The implication settled over them like a physical weight. Outside, the storm continued, though, with diminished fury. The worst had passed during the night, leaving them isolated, but no longer in immediate peril from the elements. "What do we do?" Victoria asked, looking from Mason to Rebecca. "Run. That's what I've been doing for 3 years, and it's solved nothing. James Griffin still haunts us. Lily still grows up without her mother. We're all still prisoners of that night." "We fight," Rebecca said firmly. "We use what we've learned, gather more evidence if needed, and take it to someone who can't be bought or intimidated by Griffin. The federal marshal in Helena, perhaps." "And if Griffin has already found Sophia," Victoria pressed. "If he's using her as bait to trap us." Rebecca thought of the young woman who had pressed the embroidered handkerchief into her hands, eyes wide with fear, but chin lifted in determination. "Then we spring the trap," she said. "But on our terms, not his." Mason looked at her with something like admiration. "You have a plan." "The beginnings of one," Rebecca acknowledged. "It starts with sending a warning to Sophia in St. Louis, if we can find a way to get a message there ahead of Griffin's men." "The telegraph in White Ridge," Mason suggested. "Once the storm clears." Victoria shook her head. "The telegraph operator is Griffin's cousin by marriage. Any message would go straight to him." "Then we need a messenger," Rebecca decided. "Someone who can travel to the next town, someone Griffin wouldn't suspect or stop." "There's no one," Victoria said despondently. "Everyone in White Ridge knows Griffin. Everyone fears him or respects him or owes him money." "What about Mrs. Winters?" Rebecca suggested. "She clearly has no love for Griffin, and she's been watching him for years without raising his suspicion." Mason considered this. "Lenora rarely leaves her cabin, especially in winter. It would seem odd if she suddenly traveled to Riverdale just to send a telegram." "Then I'll go," Rebecca said. "Griffin has seen me at the ranch, yes, but he believes I'm bound for Whispering Pines. It would make sense for me to stop in Riverdale on my journey." "No," Mason and Victoria said in unison with equal vehemence. "It's too dangerous," Mason continued. "If Griffin suspects your connection to Sophia, he'll be watching for exactly this kind of move." "And if he doesn't, I'm the perfect messenger," Rebecca countered. "A woman traveling alone ostensibly to meet her intended husband, stopping in Riverdale on her way to Whispering Pines." "What could be more natural?" Victoria and Mason exchanged glances, a silent communication born of years together. "There may be another way," Victoria said slowly. "Someone who could travel without raising suspicion. Someone Griffin would never suspect of working against him." "Who?" Rebecca asked. "Sheriff Caldwell's daughter, Abigail," Victoria replied. "She travels regularly between White Ridge and Riverdale, where her aunt lives. No one questions her comings and goings, not even Griffin." "The sheriff's daughter," Rebecca was skeptical. "If the sheriff is in Griffin's pocket, why would his daughter help us?" A small, sad smile touched Victoria's lips. "Because Abigail was my friend before everything. She never believed I simply vanished or died in an accident. She used to leave flowers at the base of our porch steps on the anniversary of my death. And she's been kind to Lily, bringing her books and small gifts. Even if she was your friend, that doesn't mean she'd risk her father's position or possibly her own safety to help us," Mason pointed out. "There's something else," Victoria said hesitantly. "Something I've never told you, Mason. Abigail, she knew about James, about what he did to me during our marriage. She saw the bruises once when I was visiting White Ridge shortly after we arrived in Montana. I confided in her, then made her promise never to tell anyone, not even her father." "You think that knowledge would motivate her to help now?" Rebecca asked. "I think Abigail has no love for men who hurt women," Victoria said simply. "Her own mother died under suspicious circumstances when Abigail was a child. The official story was a fall down the stairs, but, well, there were rumors. The sheriff remarried very quickly. The implication was clear, and it cast the sheriff's relationship with Griffin in a new light. Perhaps it wasn't just money or influence that bound the lawman to Griffin Harlow, but a shared propensity for violence against women, a brotherhood of abusers who protected one another. How would we approach her?" Mason asked the question itself, an indication that he was considering the possibility. "We can't exactly walk into town and request a private audience with the sheriff's daughter." "No," Victoria agreed. "But Abigail visits Lenora Winters regularly. The old woman taught her herbal medicine when Abigail was younger. If Mrs. Winters sent word that she needed to see Abigail urgently, it could work," Rebecca said, hope kindling. "Especially if Mrs. Winters is willing to be our intermediary. She's already given us her journal. I believe she would help further if asked. The storm will keep Griffin in Helena for at least another day, Mason said, moving to the window to assess the weather. The snow has stopped, but the drifts will make travel difficult until tomorrow at the earliest. That gives us time to reach Mrs. Winters, and if she's willing, arrange a meeting with Abigail. And, in the meantime, Victoria asked, her hand unconsciously moving to the locket. She wore a tiny portrait of Lily, nestled inside Rebecca knew. In the meantime, Mason said, turning back to them, we prepare for the possibility that Griffin already knows more than we think. We need a contingency plan, a way to protect Lily if things go wrong. The unspoken fear hung between them if Griffin had indeed found Sophia. If he knew Victoria was alive, then their carefully constructed facade was crumbling. Soon they would face a reckoning 3 years in the making, and only one side would emerge intact. As the day progressed, the three of them formulated plans and backup plans, considered scenarios both hopeful and dire. Outside, the world remained locked in winter's grip, the snow deep and treacherous, but no longer actively falling. By nightfall, they had settled on a course of action. Mason would return to the ranch at first light to check on Lily, while Rebecca would make her way to Mrs. Winters's cabin to request the widow's assistance in contacting Abigail Caldwell. Victoria would remain at the hunting cabin out of sight, the most vulnerable piece on their chessboard, the queen they could not afford to expose until the final move. As darkness fell, Mason prepared to bed down on the floor near the fire, leaving the narrow bed for the two women. Victoria had brought additional blankets from her supply cache, ensuring they would all be warm enough despite the biting cold that seeped through the cabin's walls. Rebecca lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, listening to the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cold, the distant howl of a wolf somewhere in the forest. So much had changed in the short time since she had arrived at Blackwood Ranch. A temporary shelter from a storm had become the epicenter of a dangerous game of secrets and revenge. And she herself had changed too. The woman who had traveled west seeking marriage to a stranger. Resignation, her primary emotion, had found something unexpected purpose. Connection. Perhaps even something like family, fragile and broken though it might be. Her hand moved to her side, to the scar that had once defined her future. The doctor's verdict that she would never bear children, the pitying glances from potential suitors, the desperate decision to seek marriage through an agency accepting whatever man would have her. Now that scar seemed less a definition of what she couldn't be and more a reminder of what she had survived. Like Victoria, like Mason, like Lily, in her silent way, survivors all scarred, but not defeated. With that thought, warming her more effectively than the blankets, Rebecca finally drifted into sleep. Morning brought clear skies and bitter cold, the sun gleaming off snow so bright it hurt the eyes. Mason left at dawn, returning to the ranch to check on Lily and maintain the appearance of normalcy should any of Griffin's informants be watching. Rebecca prepared to make her way to Mrs. Winters's cabin, bundled against the cold in Victoria's spare cloak and gloves. "Be careful," Victoria urged as Rebecca prepared to depart. "Lenora Winters is cautious by nature. She may have given you her journal, but that doesn't mean she's fully committed to our cause." "I'll tread carefully," Rebecca promised. "And I'll return as soon as I can, with news, whatever it may be." The trek to Mrs. Winters's cabin was arduous, the snow knee-deep in places, despite Rebecca's attempt to follow Mason's earlier tracks. By the time she reached the ridge where the widow's cabin perched, her legs ached and her lungs burned from the exertion of trudging through heavy drifts. Mrs. Winters answered her knock promptly, sharp eyes taking in Rebecca's snow-covered appearance. "Thought you might have frozen to death in that storm," she said by way of greeting, stepping aside to let Rebecca enter. "Or that Griffin Harlow had found you asking questions and solved the problem more directly." Neither, thankfully, Rebecca replied, gratefully moving toward the fire. Though not for lack of trying on the storm's part. The widow grunted, closing the door against the cold. You read my journal, I assume? Yes, it's been most illuminating. Rebecca unwound the scarf from her neck, allowing the warmth of the fire to begin thawing her frozen extremities. You've been watching Griffin James for years, documenting his movements, his visitors. You knew Victoria was alive, hiding in the hunting cabin. Unsuspected, Mrs. Winters corrected, moving to put a kettle on the stove. Never saw her myself. Just the signs: smoke when it shouldn't be there, laundry appearing and disappearing, extra supplies being carried into the woods by Mason when he thought no one was watching. We need your help, Rebecca said, deciding directness was the best approach with the widow. Victoria is indeed alive. She's been hiding from Griffin, from James Blackwood, her first husband, for 3 years. Now we believe he may have found her sister Sophia, and will use her to lure Victoria out of hiding. Mrs. Winters's weathered face revealed nothing, but she didn't seem surprised by the confirmation. What sort of help? She asked, measuring tea leaves into a pot. We need to send a warning to Sophia in St. Louis, but we can't use the telegraph in White Ridge. Griffin would intercept it. We thought perhaps Abigail Caldwell might help. Victoria says she visits you regularly, that you taught her herbal medicine. The widow's eyes narrowed slightly. Abigail's a good girl, she said cautiously, better than her father deserves. But you're asking her to betray the sheriff, her own blood, for a woman everyone believes is dead. I'm asking her to help prevent another death, Rebecca countered. Sophia's life may depend on receiving a warning, and Victoria has been separated from her daughter for 3 years because of James Blackwood's obsession. Isn't that punishment enough for whatever happened that night? Mrs. Winters poured the boiling water into the teapot, her movements deliberate. What did happen that night? She asked, looking directly at Rebecca. My observations tell me some of it, but not all. Before I involve Abigail in this, I want the truth. The full truth. Rebecca hesitated, uncertain how much Victoria would want revealed. But Mrs. Winters had already proven herself an ally by sharing her journal. Without complete honesty, now that alliance might fracture when they needed it most. James Blackwood was Victoria's first husband. She began accepting the cup of tea Mrs. Winters offered. He abused her terribly during their marriage. Mason, his half-brother, helped her escape to Montana, where they married for her protection. James followed them. 3 years ago, during a blizzard, he found them. There was a struggle. Sophia stabbed him with his own knife, believing she had killed him. Victoria and Sophia dragged what they thought was his body into the woods. But he wasn't dead, Mrs. Winters supplied. He crawled out of those woods later that same night, took on a new name, and has been hunting them ever since. Yes, Rebecca confirmed. And now, with Pinkerton detectives at his disposal, he may have found Sophia in St. Louis. If so, Victoria and Lily are in grave danger. Mason, too, if Griffin decides he's outlived his usefulness in this twisted game. Mrs. Winters sipped her tea, considering. Abigail comes tomorrow, she said finally. Brings me supplies from town every second Thursday. I can speak to her then, sound her out carefully. If and only if I believe she can be trusted with this, I'll arrange for her to meet you. Thank you, Rebecca said, relief evident in her voice. That's all we ask, a chance to explain, to request her help in warning Sophia. Don't thank me yet, the widow cautioned. Abigail's father has kept her sheltered, controlled. She has a good heart, but courage, real courage, the kind that risks everything, that's rarer than gold in these parts. She may not have it in her to defy her father, even for Victoria's sake. We have to try, Rebecca insisted. The alternative is to wait for Griffin to make his move to use Sophia as bait in a trap Victoria cannot help but walk into. And if Abigail refuses, what then? Rebecca had considered this possibility during her sleepless night. Then I'll go to Riverdale myself, she said, as I originally planned. If Griffin has men watching the roads, so be it. I'll take that risk. Mrs. Winters studied her with those sharp eyes that seemed to see more than most. You care for them, she observed. The Blackwoods. This isn't just about a promise to Sophia anymore, is it? The question echoed her earlier observation, but this time, Rebecca didn't shy away from it. No, she admitted. It's not just about the promise. I've come to care for Lily, for Victoria, for Mason too. They've suffered enough. They deserve peace and justice. Justice? Mrs. Winters repeated, a hint of bitterness in her tone. I've lived 6 decades and seen precious little of that, especially for women. But peace, yes, perhaps that's still possible. If Griffin Harlow or James Blackwood, whatever name he wears, can be stopped. He can be, Rebecca said with more confidence than she felt. With your help, with Abigail's, perhaps with the evidence in your journal. We can end this. The widow didn't look convinced, but she nodded slowly. Return tomorrow at midday, she said. Abigail will have come and gone by then. I'll tell you her answer, and we'll proceed accordingly. Rebecca accepted this, knowing it was the best she could hope for. She finished her tea, grateful for its warmth, before venturing back into the cold. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Winters pressed a small cloth bag into her hands, the same herbal remedy she had given Rebecca during her previous visit. For the pain, the old woman said, gesturing vaguely toward Rebecca's side. The old injury. It troubles you more in the cold, I imagine. Rebecca blinked in surprise. She hadn't mentioned her scar to Mrs. Winters, had barely touched her side in the widow's presence. Yet somehow, the old woman had known. Thank you, she said, tucking the remedy into her pocket. How did you— The way you move, Mrs. Winters interrupted. The slight hesitation when you turn too quickly. The hand that strays to your ribs when you think no one is watching. I was a midwife for 30 years, girl. I know the signs of old wounds, both visible and hidden. With that cryptic statement, she ushered Rebecca out into the brightness of the snow-covered world, closing the door firmly behind her. The return journey to the hunting cabin seemed longer. Rebecca's thoughts occupied with the conversation and Mrs. Winters's uncanny perception. The widow was right about the pain. The old injury did trouble her more in the cold, a deep ache that medication rarely touched. But she was right about the hidden wounds, too, the ones that didn't show on the skin, but ran deeper, shaped by loss and grief. And the things war had shown her about human capacity for both cruelty and courage. Victoria was waiting anxiously when Rebecca arrived, pacing the small confines of the cabin like a caged animal. What did she say? She asked immediately. Will Lenora help us? Rebecca shed her snow-covered outer garments, moving to warm her hands by the fire. Abigail visits her tomorrow, she explained. Mrs. Winters will sound her out, see if she's willing to help. We'll know more then. Victoria's face fell slightly, hope dampened by the delay. Tomorrow, she repeated. Another day for Griffin to act, if he's found Sophia. We don't know that he has, Rebecca reminded her. Mrs. Winters's observation about the visitor who upset him could mean anything. Until we have confirmation, we proceed as planned. And Mason, has he returned from the ranch? Not yet, Rebecca said, glancing at the window where afternoon light was already beginning to fade. Winter days were short in the Northern Territories. He should be back soon before dark. Victoria resumed her pacing, tension evident in every line of her body. I have a bad feeling, she admitted, a sense that events are accelerating beyond our control. James Griffin, He's patient, but once he moves, he strikes with terrible efficiency. If he knows I'm alive, if he's found Sophia, we'll be ready, Rebecca assured her, though the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. How could they truly be ready for whatever a man like James Blackwood might do, a man who had stalked his prey for 3 years, assuming a new identity, building a position of influence, all to exact revenge for a wound inflicted in self-defense? As dusk approached with no sign of Mason, Rebecca's own unease grew. He should have returned hours ago. The ranch was less than an hour's ride from the hunting cabin, even in deep snow. Had something delayed him? Or worse, had something happened to him? I'm going to look for him, Victoria decided as darkness fell in earnest. He would have sent word if he was staying at the ranch overnight. No, Rebecca said firmly. If Griffin has returned early, if he's watching the ranch, you're the one person who cannot risk being seen. I'll go. You don't know the way in the dark, Victoria protested. And if something has happened, then one of us needs to remain free to help, Rebecca interrupted, to contact Mrs. Winters, to reach Abigail if she agrees to help to warn Sophia. That person has to be you, Victoria, for Lily's sake, if nothing else. The argument was persuasive, touching as it did on Victoria's deepest vulnerability, her daughter. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded reluctantly. Take the rifle, she said, retrieving the weapon from beside the door. And the lantern. Stay to the tree line as you approach the ranch. There's less snow under the pines, and you'll be less visible if someone is watching. Rebecca accepted both items, checking that the rifle was loaded, as Mason had taught her during their journey to Mrs. Winters's cabin the previous day. She was no stranger to firearms. Field hospitals in war zones had necessitated basic proficiency, but the weight of the weapon felt ominous in her hands, now a tacit acknowledgement that she might need to use it. I'll return as soon as I can, she promised, securing her cloak and pulling the hood up to protect against the bitter night air. With Mason, if possible. If not with news, at least. Victoria caught her arm as she turned to go. Be careful, she said, eyes intense in the lamplight. Griffin is dangerous in ways you can't fully comprehend, even having heard our story. He doesn't just want revenge. He wants to break what he couldn't possess, to destroy what defied him. He won't stop until we're all dead or under his control. I understand, Rebecca said softly. I won't underestimate him. The night was clear and brutally cold, stars glittering like shards of ice in the black sky. Rebecca kept the lantern shuttered as she made her way through the forest, using the moon's reflection on the snow to guide her path. Victoria's directions were precise. Follow the creek for half a mile, then turn west at the lightning-struck pine stay within the tree line until the ranch house came into view. The profound silence of the winter forest was broken only by the crunch of snow beneath her boots and the occasional crack of a branch releasing its burden of ice. Rebecca moved as quietly as possible, mindful of Victoria's warning about watchers. If Griffin had indeed returned early from Helena, if he suspected Victoria's survival, he might well have men observing the ranch, noting who came and went. As she neared the edge of the forest, where the ranch buildings would become visible, Rebecca extinguished the lantern entirely. Moving now by moonlight alone, she approached cautiously, keeping to the shadows of the pines that bordered the cleared land surrounding the Blackwood home. The ranch lay quiet under its blanket of snow. Windows dark, except for a faint glow from what Rebecca knew was the kitchen. No movement disturbed the pristine white expanse of the yard. No horses stood in the corral. The scene appeared peaceful, ordinary, yet something raised the hairs on the back of Rebecca's neck. Some instinct honed in field hospitals where danger often arrived without warning. Something was wrong. The silence was too complete. The darkness too absolute for a household where a child lived, where lamps should be lit, against the early winter night. Rebecca hesitated at the edge of the trees, debating her approach. The front door would leave her exposed, crossing open ground, where moonlight on snow would make her clearly visible to anyone watching. The back entrance through the kitchen garden, now buried under drifts, offered more cover, but might be locked. As she deliberated, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness beside the barn, moving with deliberate stealth toward the house. Then another approaching from the opposite direction. Men. At least two, possibly more, converging on the Blackwood home with the practiced coordination of hunters closing in on prey. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. Griffin's men, surely, but was Griffin himself among them? Had he returned from Helena with some new information, some confirmation of his suspicions that had prompted this night raid? And what of Mason and Lily? Were they inside, unaware of the danger surrounding them? Rebecca raised the rifle sighting along its barrel, but the distance was too great, the darkness too complete for any hope of accuracy. She would need to get closer to see more clearly what was happening before she could act. Moving with painful slowness to avoid the telltale crunch of snow, she edged along the tree line until she reached the point nearest the barn. From there, keeping low, she darted across the open space to the shelter of the structure, heart pounding so loudly she feared it might betray her position. Pressed against the rough wood of the barn wall, Rebecca caught her breath and assessed the situation. The men, she counted four now, had taken positions around the house, one at each corner, effectively cutting off any escape. A fifth figure emerged from the shadows of the porch, his bearing familiar even in the dim light. Griffin Harlow. James Blackwood. Whatever name he used, Rebecca recognized the predatory confidence in his stance, the calculated patience of a man who had waited years for this moment. He signaled to his men, a sharp gesture that needed no verbal accompaniment. Two of them moved to the front door, while the others maintained their positions, rifles ready. Griffin himself remained on the porch, watching as his subordinates prepared to enter. Rebecca needed to act, and quickly. If Mason and Lily were inside, they were moments away from capture or worse. If they weren't, then Griffin's raid would reveal nothing but an empty house, and his suspicions might fade for lack of confirmation. Either way, she couldn't allow him to proceed unchallenged. But what could one woman with a rifle do against 5 armed men? Create a diversion, she decided. Draw them away from the house. Give Mason a chance to escape with Lily if they were inside, or at least alert Griffin's quarry that the hunter had returned if they weren't. Taking careful aim at the sky above the men's heads, Rebecca fired a single shot. The crack of the rifle shattered the night's silence, echoing across the snow-covered yard. Instantly, the men whirled toward the source of the sound, rifles raised. Rebecca was already moving, darting behind the barn. Before returning, fire could find her. She circled the structure, emerging on the far side with a clear view of the house's back entrance. If Mason was inside, if he had any sense at all, he would use this momentary confusion to escape through the kitchen door while Griffin's men focused on the barn. But the back door remained closed, no figure emerging into the night. Either Mason wasn't inside, or he was in no condition to flee. Griffin's voice cut through the night, cold and controlled. "Spread out. Find whoever fired that shot. Carter Dawson, check the barn. Ellis, the house. Monroe with me." The men moved with military precision, too, approaching the barn, where Rebecca had been moments before, one entering the house through the front door, while Griffin and the remaining man began a methodical sweep of the yard, working their way toward the tree line, where Rebecca had initially hidden. She needed to move again to stay ahead of the search, but each movement risked detection in the snow, each new position potentially a trap if Griffin's men surrounded her. Making a swift decision, Rebecca darted toward the house itself, the last place they would expect her to go, directly into the center of their operation. Using the deep shadows along the foundation, she worked her way to the kitchen door, easing it open with excruciating slowness to prevent any betraying creak. The kitchen was dark, but for the dying embers in the stove, the air unnaturally cold for a house that should have been heated against the winter night. Rebecca closed the door silently behind her, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dimness as she listened for any sound that might indicate Mason or Lily's presence or the approach of Griffin's man who had entered through the front. A floorboard creaked overhead, someone moving in the upper rooms searching. Rebecca pressed herself against the wall beside the door leading to the main part of the house, rifle ready. If the man came into the kitchen, she would have one chance to subdue him before he raised the alarm. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Outside, she could hear Griffin and his men calling to each other as they searched the barn, the corral, the small outbuildings that dotted the ranch yard. Soon, they would return to the house, having found nothing in their initial sweep. The floor creaked again, closer now, approaching the top of the stairs. Rebecca tensed, preparing for confrontation. But before the footsteps could descend, a sound from outside froze her in place. The unmistakable whinny of a horse, followed by the steady rhythm of hooves approaching the ranch. A new arrival. Mason perhaps returning, unaware of the danger that awaited him, or reinforcements for Griffin, additional men to aid in the search. The footsteps overhead halted the searcher clearly, hearing the approach as well. A moment later, he was moving rapidly down the stairs toward the front of the house where Griffin and the others had already gathered attention focused on the newcomer. Rebecca used the distraction to move deeper into the house, slipping from the kitchen into the main room where she could peer through a window without being seen. What she witnessed made her blood run cold. Mason had indeed returned, but not alone, and not free. He sat astride his horse, hands bound before him, face bruised and bloody in the moonlight. Beside him on a separate mount rode a man Rebecca didn't recognize, tall and lean, with the hard eyes and steady hands of a professional gunman. And there, riding a third horse, was a woman, slight fair-haired, her face a feminine echo of Victoria's. Sophia Hayes, Rebecca realized with a shock of recognition. Griffin had found her after all had brought her to Montana as bait in his elaborate trap. Griffin stepped forward as the small party reached the yard, a smile spreading across his scarred face. "Well done, Jenkins," he called to the stranger. "I see you found our guests." "On the road from town," the man replied, dismounting smoothly. "This one," he jerked his head toward Mason, "was headed this way. Put up quite a fight when we intercepted him." "And the woman, she came willingly." Jenkins laughed, a sound without mirth. "Hardly, but she became more cooperative when I explained the alternatives." Griffin approached Sophia, who sat rigid in her saddle face, pale but composed. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice a mockery of gentility, "how kind of you to join our little reunion. Your sister will be so pleased to see you." "My sister is dead," Sophia replied, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "Your men killed her 3 years ago, according to Sheriff Caldwell's report." "Ah, yes, the official story." Griffin's smile widened. "But we both know that's not quite accurate, don't we? Just as we know your charming friend, Miss Rebecca Hayes, set out from St. Louis with specific instructions to find Victoria. Instructions from you." Rebecca froze at the mention of her name. Griffin knew everything: her connection to Sophia, her mission to find Victoria. The elaborate game she had thought they were playing had been Griffin's design all along, each move, anticipated each piece positioned according to his plan. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sophia insisted. Rebecca was a boarder at the same house where I worked. We were barely acquainted. Yet you gave her a handkerchief embroidered with a rather specific message, Griffin countered, for those who cannot fly home. Poetic, I must say. And effective, it led her directly to Blackwood Ranch, where I'm certain she's uncovered all sorts of interesting information in my absence. He turned to his men. Search the house again, thoroughly this time. Miss Hayes, our Miss Hayes is resourceful. If Mason here was returning to the ranch, it suggests he expected to find someone waiting. Perhaps his wife, or perhaps our mutual acquaintance from St. Louis. Rebecca retreated deeper into the shadows as the men moved to obey her mind racing. She needed to escape to warn Victoria that the trap had already been sprung, that Griffin had captured Mason and was now closing in on his final targets. But escape seemed impossible with Griffin's men surrounding the house with Mason and Sophia already captive. And even if she could flee, revealing her presence now would only confirm Griffin's suspicions that Victoria was alive and in hiding nearby. A terrible choice confronted her: remain hidden, watching as Griffin's plan unfolded, or act now and risk everything. Before she could decide, the decision was made for her. A floorboard creaked beneath her foot, a small sound, but in the tense silence it carried like a gunshot. The man searching the ground floor turned sharply, his rifle coming up. "Someone's in here," he called. "In the parlor." Rebecca didn't hesitate. She fired the rifle at the ceiling, creating another moment of chaos, then bolted for the kitchen and the back door beyond. Behind her, shouts erupted as Griffin ordered his men to catch her. Ahead lay the darkness of the night, the shelter of the forest if she could reach it. She burst through this kitchen door into the biting cold, running flat out toward the tree line. Snow dragged at her feet, slowing her progress, while behind her came the sound of pursuit, multiple sets of footsteps crunching through the crusty surface. "There! By the trees!" someone shouted. A rifle cracked the bullet, whining past Rebecca's head, close enough that she felt the disturbance in the air. She zigzagged, making herself a harder target, pushing her body to its limits. The trees were so close now, their dark shelter promising at least temporary safety. Just a few more yards. Pain exploded in her side, not her old wound, but a new one, hot and sharp. The impact spun her halfway around, but she kept her feet, staggering the last few steps into the cover of the pines before collapsing against a trunk, breath coming in harsh gasps. Shot. She'd been shot. Her hand came away from her side, wet and warm despite the freezing air. Not fatal. She assessed automatically, the nurse in her taking clinical note, even as the woman fought rising panic. The bullet had caught her in the flesh just below the ribs, a through-and-through wound that bled freely but hadn't hit anything vital. Behind her, Griffin's men were spreading out, entering the forest at different points to cut off her escape. She could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their search pattern with practiced efficiency. She couldn't outrun them, not wounded and in deep snow. Couldn't hide effectively with a blood trail marking her path. Her only hope lay in reaching the hunting cabin, in warning Victoria, before Griffin's men tracked her there. Pushing away from the tree, Rebecca forced herself forward deeper into the forest. Each step sent fresh pain lancing through her side, each breath a battle against the urge to cry out. But she kept moving, following the path she had traveled earlier, trusting her memory and the occasional glimpse of moonlight through the branches to guide her. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as the men searched in widening circles, unsure of her direction in the darkness. She had gained a small advantage, but how long before they found her trail, before the blood drops on snow led them unerringly to Victoria's hideaway? Time became meaningless, measured only in heartbeats and painful steps. The creek appeared before her like a silver ribbon in the moonlight, the first landmark Victoria had mentioned. Follow it for half a mile. then turn west at the lightning-struck pine. Rebecca pressed on one hand, clutched to her bleeding side, the other still gripping the rifle, though she had no more ammunition. The lightning-struck pine loomed ahead, its shattered top a stark silhouette against the night sky. Rebecca turned west, as instructed, her pace slowing as blood loss began to take its toll. Dizziness swept over her in waves, forcing her to pause frequently, leaning against trees for support. How much farther? The cabin couldn't be more than a quarter-mile away now, but in her condition, it might as well have been leagues. Rebecca focused on placing one foot before the other, on staying conscious despite the cold and shock that threatened to overwhelm her. A light appeared between the trees, the warm glow of a lantern in a window. The hunting cabin. Relief surged through Rebecca, giving her a final burst of energy. She stumbled the last few yards to the door, collapsing against it with barely enough strength to knock. The door opened immediately, Victoria's anxious face transformed to horror as she took in Rebecca's blood-soaked appearance. "Rebecca, my God, what happened? Griffin." Rebecca managed her voice a harsh whisper. "At the ranch. He has Mason and Sophia. His men, they're coming, following my trail." Victoria pulled her inside, helping her to a chair near the fire. "You're shot," she said, quickly assessing the wound. "How bad?" "Through and through," Rebecca replied, wincing as Victoria cut away the fabric of her dress to expose the injury. "Not fatal, but I've lost blood. Victoria, listen to me. You have to go. Now. They'll follow my tracks straight to the cabin." "I can't leave you like this," Victoria protested, already gathering cloths to staunch the bleeding. "You must," Rebecca insisted. "Griffin wants you, Victoria. That's what this has all been about, finding you, using Sophia and Mason as bait. If you're captured too, there's no hope for any of us." Victoria's hands stilled her face, a study in conflicting emotions: fear, determination, anguish. "Where would I go in winter, with Griffin's men between here and town? Mrs. Winters," Rebecca suggested, her thoughts growing sluggish as shock deepened. "She'll hide you, help you reach Abigail Caldwell. It's our only chance now." Victoria hesitated, clearly torn between staying to tend Rebecca's wound and fleeing while she still could. "And you? I'll slow them down," Rebecca said with more confidence than she felt. "Make them think you've gone in another direction. Buy you time to reach Lenora's cabin." "They'll kill you," Victoria whispered, the terrible truth they both understood but had not voiced. "Perhaps," Rebecca acknowledged, "but they'll kill us both if you stay. And then Mason and Sophia and Lily will have no one left to fight for them." She gripped Victoria's hand with surprising strength. "Go, now, through the back toward the ridge. Don't leave tracks if you can help it." After another moment's hesitation, Victoria nodded, her decision made. She quickly gathered a few essential items: the locket with Lily's portrait, a small knife, the warmest cloak. Then she knelt beside Rebecca, pressing a cloth firmly against the wound. "Hold this in place," she instructed. "The bleeding has slowed, but you need to keep pressure on it." Her eyes, so like Lily's in their striking blue, met Rebecca's with fierce intensity. "Stay alive, Rebecca Hayes. Whatever happens, whatever Griffin does, stay alive. For all of us." Rebecca nodded, no strength left for words. Victoria squeezed her hand once, then was gone, slipping out the back door of the cabin into the cold embrace of the night. Alone now, Rebecca tried to focus, to plan her next move. Griffin's men would follow her blood trail to the cabin that was inevitable. When they found her, she needed to convince them Victoria had never been there, had fled in another direction entirely. She dragged herself to the bed, leaving deliberate blood smears on the blankets, creating the impression she had lain there alone. Then, with painstaking effort, she erased all signs of Victoria's recent presence. The second teacup, the book she had been reading, the hairbrush on the table. Finally, Rebecca positioned herself in the chair by the fire rifle across her lap, facing the door. When Griffin's men arrived, they would find a wounded woman defiant in her solitude. Not two fugitives, one already escaped. Outside, the distant sounds of pursuit grew louder, voices calling to each other through the trees, the crunch of snow beneath multiple boots. They had found her trail, were following it, with the relentless determination of hunters who sensed their quarry was weakening. Rebecca checked the makeshift bandage at her side, still bleeding, but more slowly now. If she survived the coming confrontation, if Griffin didn't simply order his men to kill her on sight, she might yet live through this night. A small hope, perhaps, but the only one remaining to her. That, and the knowledge that Victoria was free, moving through the darkness toward Mrs. Winters's cabin, and the possible ally they had found in Abigail Caldwell. The voices were very close now, just beyond the cabin walls. Rebecca straightened in her chair, ignoring the pain that lanced through her side at the movement. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage she had witnessed in Victoria, in Mason, even in Silent Lily. The door burst open, admitting a blast of cold air, and 3 of Griffin's men rifles raised and aimed at her heart. Behind them, stepping into the light, with the confident stride of a predator who knows his prey is cornered, came Griffin Harlow James Blackwood, his scarred face split in a triumphant smile. "Miss Hayes," he said, his voice as cold as the night outside, "how considerate of you to wait up for us. Now, where is my wife?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Rebecca said, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the pain that radiated from her wound. "I have no wife to offer you, Mr. Harlow." Griffin's smile never wavered as he stepped fully into the cabin, closing the door behind him while his men maintained their aim on Rebecca. "Let's dispense with pretense, shall we? You know exactly who I am, James Blackwood, not Griffin Harlow. Just as you know that Victoria Blackwood, my legal wife, is very much alive, despite the charming fiction Mason has maintained these past 3 years. He moved around the small space with the casual confidence of a man who feared nothing within its walls, noting the single teacup on the table, the lone indentation on the bed, the solitary set of bloodied clothes discarded nearby. "Interesting," he mused. "One would think from the evidence that you've been here alone." His pale eyes, shrewd and calculating, returned to Rebecca. "Yet the cabin is warm, the fire recently tended, and there are 2 chairs drawn up to the table. Someone else was here, Miss Hayes, someone who fled when you arrived wounded." Rebecca maintained her silence, pressing the cloth more firmly against her side, as a fresh wave of pain washed over her. One of Griffin's men, the one called Jenkins, moved to the back door, opening it to reveal the pristine snow beyond. "No tracks, sir," he reported. "If someone left, they didn't go this way." Griffin nodded thoughtfully. "Check around the perimeter, all of you. Find where she went." The men filed out, leaving Griffin alone with Rebecca. He pulled the second chair close to hers, sitting with the relaxed posture of someone settling in for a pleasant conversation. "You're bleeding quite badly," he observed, gesturing to the darkening cloth at her side. "One of my men got lucky, it seems. Tell me where Victoria has gone, and I'll have Jenkins tend to that wound. He has some medical experience, not as extensive as yours, I'm sure, but sufficient to keep you alive until we reach town." "Why would you care if I live or die?" Rebecca asked, buying time, hoping Victoria had gotten far enough away that Griffin's men would not easily find her trail. "I admire resourcefulness, Miss Hayes," and courage." Griffin leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on an almost intimate quality. "You've shown both in abundance, following Sophia's directive to find Victoria, integrating yourself into the Blackwood household, earning the trust of a traumatized child and her guilt-ridden father. Most impressive of all, discovering Victoria's hiding place when my own searches proved fruitless for 3 years." "If you know so much," Rebecca challenged, "why do you need anything from me?" Griffin's smile tightened. "Because despite my best efforts, Victoria has slipped away yet again. And while I could simply wait, I have Mason and Sophia after all the perfect bait for a woman who cares deeply for both. I find my patience has limits. 3 years is quite long enough to play this particular game." "It's not a game to them," Rebecca said, anger momentarily overcoming caution. "It's survival." "Semantics," Griffin dismissed with a wave of his hand. "The point remains. Victoria is running, and you know where. Tell me, and this unpleasantness can end tonight. Mason and Sophia go free, you receive medical attention, and Victoria—" He paused, something dark and possessive flickering in his eyes. "Victoria returns to her rightful place as my wife." "She's not your wife anymore," Rebecca countered. "She married Mason after escaping you. Legally, morally, in every way that matters, she is his wife, not yours." Griffin's expression hardened, the facade of civility slipping. "A marriage built on deception has no validity. Victoria is mine. The law will confirm it once certain inconvenient facts are omitted from the record." His gaze grew calculating. "Such as Sophia's attempted murder of me that night, or Mason's harboring of a fugitive, my wife, for 3 years, both capital offenses in this territory. The threat was clear. If Victoria didn't surrender, Griffin would ensure Mason and Sophia hanged for crimes he himself had orchestrated. Rebecca had no doubt he could accomplish this, his influence with the local sheriff. His carefully constructed reputation as Griffin Harlow would make it all too easy to twist the truth to serve his purposes. "Victoria went north," Rebecca lied, gesturing vaguely with her free hand. "Toward the high country. She has a second shelter there, a cave stocked with supplies. She said if you ever found the hunting cabin, she would head there and wait for spring." Griffin studied her face, searching for signs of deception. "The high country would be suicide in winter," he said skeptically. "Victoria is many things, but not foolish." "Desperate people make desperate choices," Rebecca replied, allowing some of her genuine fear for Victoria to color her words. "She believes you'll kill her if you find her. Death in the mountains might seem preferable." A commotion outside interrupted their conversation, raised voices, the sound of a brief struggle. The door burst open, admitting 2 of Griffin's men, half dragging a third, whose leg appeared to be injured. "What happened?" Griffin demanded, rising from his chair. "Monroe stepped in a trap, sir," Jenkins reported, helping lower the wounded man to the floor. "Old bear trap, hidden under the snow, near that lightning-struck pine. Damn near took his foot off." Griffin's gaze snapped back to Rebecca, sudden understanding dawning. "She didn't go north," he said softly. "Victoria set traps along her escape route, not to catch animals, but to slow pursuers. She's gone to town, hasn't she? To the sheriff, or perhaps the telegraph office." Rebecca maintained her expression, neither confirming nor denying his conclusion. In truth, she had no idea if Victoria had set traps. It seemed unlikely given the speed of her departure. More probable that the trap was an old one, forgotten and buried by successive snowfalls until Monroe's unlucky step triggered it. But if Griffin believed Victoria had deliberately laid obstacles on the path to town, his men would focus their search in that direction away from the ridge where Mrs. Winters's cabin perched. Griffin turned to Jenkins. "Take 4 men and head toward White Ridge. Search the road any shortcuts she might use. She'll be making for the telegraph office or the stage depot somewhere she can send word out of the territory. The rest of you continue searching the woods in a widening circle from this cabin. She can't have gotten far in this cold." As the men hurried to obey, Griffin returned his attention to Rebecca. "Clever," he acknowledged, "but ultimately futile. Victoria has nowhere to go that I won't find her, no ally who won't eventually betray her location willingly or otherwise." Rebecca said nothing, conserving her strength, as blood continued to seep through the makeshift bandage at her side. Each minute that passed was another minute Victoria moved further from the cabin, another minute closer to potential safety at Mrs. Winters's home. "Your wound needs attention," Griffin observed, noting her increasing pallor. "I'm not without mercy, Miss Hayes. Tell me honestly where Victoria has gone, and I'll have one of my men take you to town to the doctor." "I've told you what I know," Rebecca insisted. "She went north toward the high country. Whether you believe me or not is your concern, not mine." Griffin studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You're either very loyal or very foolish," he said finally. "Either way, you're of no further use to me here." He turned to the man tending Monroe's injured leg. "Dawson, once Monroe is stabilized, take Miss Hayes to the ranch. Lock her in the root cellar until I return. If she's still alive by then, we'll decide what to do with her." Dawson nodded, not looking up from his task of binding Monroe's mangled leg with strips torn from a blanket. Griffin donned his coat and gloves, preparing to join the search himself. "A shame it's come to this," he said, pausing at the door. "You might have made a valuable ally, Miss Hayes. Instead, you'll be remembered, if at all, as a misguided woman who interfered in matters beyond her understanding." With that parting remark, he stepped out into the night, closing the door firmly behind him. Left alone with the 2 men, Rebecca took stock of her increasingly dire situation. The blood loss was making her lightheaded, her extremities growing cold as shock set in. Without proper medical attention soon, she would lapse into unconsciousness and, eventually, death. Yet even in her weakened state, she recognized that Griffin's order to take her to the ranch presented an opportunity. If she could somehow overcome Dawson during the journey, she might escape, might even reach Lily, ensure the child's safety before Griffin returned. It was a slim hope, dependent on strength she wasn't sure she possessed, but it was the only path forward she could see. Dawson finished binding Monroe's leg and helped the injured man to a more comfortable position near the fire. "The trap got the muscle, not the bone," he told his companion. "You'll walk again, but not tonight. I'll send someone back for you once I've delivered the woman to the ranch." Monroe nodded grimly, pain evident in the tight lines around his mouth. "Go on, then. Don't want to keep the boss waiting." Dawson turned to Rebecca, assessing her condition with cold efficiency. "Can you walk, or do I need to carry you?" "I can walk," Rebecca replied, though she wasn't entirely certain this was true. "Just help me up." With Dawson's reluctant assistance, she rose from the chair, biting back a cry as the movement sent fresh pain lancing through her side. Once on her feet, she swayed dangerously, gripping the back of the chair for support. "This is a waste of time," Dawson muttered. "You'll never make it to the ranch in your condition." Nevertheless, he helped her don her cloak, positioning her arm so that she could maintain pressure on her wound. The journey from the cabin was a nightmare of pain and cold. Rebecca focused solely on remaining conscious, on placing one foot before the other in the deep snow. Dawson half-supported, half-dragged her through the forest, his impatience growing with each laborious step. "Should have just left you there," he grumbled as they paused for the third time in as many minutes, Rebecca leaning heavily against a tree trunk. "You'll bleed out before we reach the ranch anyway." "Why does he want me alive?" Rebecca asked between harsh breaths, genuinely curious despite her circumstances. "Griffin, why not simply kill me at the cabin?" Dawson shrugged. "Boss has his reasons. Maybe he thinks you know more than you're saying. Maybe he plans to use you as leverage if his men don't find Victoria tonight." He eyed her speculatively. "Or maybe he just enjoys having pretty women at his mercy. Wouldn't be the first time." The casual cruelty of the observation confirmed everything Victoria had said about James Blackwood. Whatever his outward appearance as the respectable Griffin Harlow, beneath that facade lurked a predator who viewed women as possessions to be controlled, broken, discarded when they no longer served his purposes. They continued their slow progress through the forest, Rebecca growing weaker with each step. The trees began to thin, indicating they were approaching the cleared land surrounding the ranch. In the distance, she could make out the dark silhouette of the house against the star-filled sky. "Almost there," Dawson said, his tone suggesting this was no comfort. "Root cellars round back. Cold as a tomb this time of year, but it locks from the outside, which is what matters to the boss." Rebecca's mind worked sluggishly, seeking some way to escape, or at least to delay their arrival. If she could somehow incapacitate Dawson, she might reach the house, find Lily, ensure the child was safe before Griffin returned. But her body betrayed her intentions. As they emerged from the tree line into the open ground of the ranch yard, her legs finally gave way, buckling beneath her. She collapsed into the snow, the impact sending a fresh wave of agony through her wounded side. Dawson cursed, bending to haul her upright. "Come on, woman. Few more yards and you can rest all you want." As he leaned close, Rebecca summoned her remaining strength and drove her elbow into his throat, a desperate, clumsy blow that nevertheless caught him by surprise. He staggered back, choking hands at his neck. Rebecca tried to rise to run, but her body refused to cooperate. She managed only to drag herself a few feet through the snow before Dawson recovered, anger replacing his earlier impatience. "Shouldn't have done that," he growled, stalking toward her fallen form. "Boss wants you alive, but he didn't say nothing about unharmed." He reached for her hand, raised to strike, and suddenly jerked backward, a look of surprise crossing his face, before he collapsed face first into the snow. Behind him stood a slender figure, holding what appeared to be a cast-iron skillet, now dented from its impact with Dawson's skull. "Miss Hayes?" a young woman's voice asked uncertainly. "Rebecca Hayes." Rebecca blinked, struggling to focus on her unexpected savior. The woman approached cautiously, kneeling beside her in the snow. By the light of the moon, Rebecca could make out a pretty face, framed by dark curls escaping from beneath a woolen hat. "I'm Abigail," the woman said. "Abigail Caldwell. Mrs. Winters sent me to find you." "Victoria." Rebecca managed her voice barely audible. "Did she reach Lenora's cabin?" Abigail nodded. "Yes, about an hour ago. Mrs. Winters is hiding her in the root cellar. She sent me to warn you and Mason that Griffin Harlow has returned early from Helena." A small, bitter laugh escaped her. "Though it seems I'm rather late with that news." "Mason, captured," Rebecca explained haltingly. "Sophia, too. Griffin brought her from St. Louis." Abigail's expression tightened with concern. "We need to get you inside, Miss Hayes. You're bleeding badly." "No, not safe," Rebecca protested weakly. "Griffin's men, searching for Victoria." "They're searching the road to town and the north woods," Abigail countered. "None remain at the ranch I watched from the ridge, to be sure, before approaching. And this one," she nudged Dawson's unconscious form with her foot, won't be waking any time soon." With surprising strength for her slight frame, Abigail helped Rebecca to her feet and half-carried her toward the ranch house. "Lily is safe," she assured Rebecca as they made their slow progress. "Mrs. Winters had me check on her earlier today when Mason didn't return from town. She's with the Thompsons, a family 2 miles east, who have no connection to Griffin. I told them Mason had urgent business in Helena and needed someone to watch Lily for a few days." Relief washed over Rebecca at this news. At least the child was out of Griffin's reach, for now spared whatever violence might unfold in the coming hours. Inside the house, Abigail helped Rebecca to the kitchen table, then quickly lit lamps and stoked the fire in the stove. With efficient movements that spoke of some medical training, she gathered clean cloths, a basin of water, and a small leather case from her satchel. "Mrs. Winters taught me basic wound care," she explained, helping Rebecca remove her blood-soaked cloak and dress. "I'm no doctor, but I can clean and bind that injury well enough to keep you alive until we can get you proper help." As Abigail worked, Rebecca studied her more carefully. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with intelligent eyes and capable hands that moved with confidence as she cleaned the bullet wound. There was a quiet determination in her manner that reminded Rebecca of Victoria, the same steel beneath a gentle exterior. "Why are you helping us?" Rebecca asked, as Abigail applied a poultice of herbs to the wound. "Your father is the sheriff. He's Griffin's ally." A shadow crossed Abigail's face. "My father is a weak man who aligns himself with power regardless of its source or nature," she said quietly. "He looked the other way when my mother died, fell down the stairs. They said, though the bruises on her throat told a different story. He's been looking the other way ever since, especially where Griffin Harlow is concerned." She paused in her ministrations, meeting Rebecca's gaze directly. "I knew Victoria before everything happened. She was kind to me when kindness was in short supply. When Mrs. Winters told me she was alive, that she needed help, well, some debts can't be ignored, even at great personal risk." "And now," Rebecca asked as Abigail began binding the wound with clean bandages, "what's your plan?" "Mrs. Winters and I have been preparing for this possibility for some time," Abigail replied. "Not specifically for Victoria's return, but for a moment when we might act against Griffin Harlow. We've gathered evidence documents showing discrepancies in his business dealings, testimonies from women he's harmed in ways similar to Victoria records of his movements that contradict his public accounts of his past." "Mrs. Winters's journal," Rebecca remembered. "She gave it to me, but I left it at the hunting cabin when Victoria fled." "I have it," Abigail assured her, finishing the bandaging with a neat knot. "Victoria brought it with her. It's perhaps our most compelling evidence, a meticulous record from an unimpeachable witness with no personal stake in the matter." Rebecca sat back carefully, the pain in her side dulled somewhat by Abigail's ministrations. "Evidence won't help Mason and Sophia if Griffin kills them tonight," she pointed out. "And all the proof in the world means nothing if the local law your father refuses to act on it." "Which is why we're not taking it to my father," Abigail said, washing blood from her hands in the basin. "There's a federal marshal in Helena, Joshua Blackwood. No relation to Mason despite the shared name. He's been investigating Griffin for months on suspicion of fraud and possible connections to a series of bank robberies across the territory." "How do you know this?" A small, sly smile crossed Abigail's face. "I work at the telegraph office 3 days a week. My father thinks it's an appropriate occupation for a respectable young woman. He doesn't realize it gives me access to every message that passes through White Ridge, including those between Griffin and his associates in Helena and between my father and various officials he corresponds with." Rebecca's estimation of the young woman rose considerably. So Marshal Blackwood is already suspicious of Griffin. Yes, but lacking hard evidence to act. What we've gathered combined with Victoria and Sophia's testimony, if we can free them, would be more than sufficient for an arrest. The difficulty lies in reaching the marshal in time to save Mason and Sophia. How long would it take to get to Helena? 3 days by stage in good weather, Abigail replied. Less by horseback if the passes are clear, which they won't be after the recent storm. Rebecca considered this, her mind working more clearly now that her wound had been tended and the bleeding slowed. We don't have 3 days, she said. Griffin won't wait that long. He'll either force Victoria to reveal herself by threatening Mason and Sophia, or he'll eliminate them if he believes they're no longer useful as bait. Then we need to free them first, Abigail said with simple determination. Tonight, while Griffin and most of his men are searching for Victoria. And we're 2 women, 1 badly wounded, against however many men Griffin has left guarding his prisoners. 3 women, Abigail corrected. Victoria won't remain hidden at Mrs. Winter's cabin, not with Mason and her sister in Griffin's hands. And as for how, she reached into her satchel and withdrew a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. Mrs. Winters prepared this, a powerful sedative that can be added to food or drink without detection. 1 drop induces sleep within minutes. 3 drops. She let the implication hang in the air. Rebecca stared at the vial, understanding dawning. You plan to poison Griffin's men. I plan to incapacitate them, Abigail clarified. Temporarily or permanently depends on how desperate our situation becomes. I've spent my life watching men like Griffin Harlow and my father operate with impunity, Miss Hayes. I won't shed tears if some of their associates fail to wake from their slumber. The cold calculation in her voice was at odds with her gentle appearance, reminding Rebecca that survival on the frontier often required moral compromises unthinkable in more civilized settings. Yet she couldn't fault Abigail's reasoning. Griffin and his men had demonstrated they would kill without hesitation to achieve their aims. Why should those opposing them operate under more restrictive rules? Where are Mason and Sophia being held? Rebecca asked, focusing on the practical aspects of the plan. The line shack near the eastern boundary of the ranch, Abigail replied. It's where Griffin conducts his more private business, isolated, sturdy, with only 1 entrance. According to Mrs. Winters, who watches his comings and goings with remarkable diligence, he took them there directly upon returning from Helena. How many men guard it? 2 usually, perhaps more tonight given the importance of the prisoners. Rebecca nodded, thinking through the logistics. And your plan beyond the sedative? Abigail outlined her strategy, simple but potentially effective. She would approach the line shack, claiming to bring food and coffee from Griffin, a thoughtful gesture for men standing guard on a cold night. Once they consumed the drugged refreshments, she would free Mason and Sophia. Then all would make their way to Mrs. Winters's cabin, where Victoria waited. From there they would travel to Riverdale, the next town over, where Abigail had an ally in the telegraph operator, a man with no connection to Griffin or Sheriff Caldwell. We'll send word to Marshal Blackwood, she concluded. Request his immediate presence with as many deputies as he can muster. With luck, he'll arrive before Griffin realizes we've escaped the territory. And if we're not lucky? Rebecca asked, ever practical. Abigail's expression hardened. Then we keep moving. Mrs. Winters has connections throughout the territory, women who've suffered at men's hands and created their own network of safe houses and escape routes. It's how many wives flee abusive husbands in these parts, how I plan to leave once I'd saved enough money. This revelation that Abigail had her own reasons for opposing men like Griffin beyond her friendship with Victoria added another layer to Rebecca's understanding of the young woman. Not just an ally of convenience, but someone with personal stakes in seeing Griffin's power broken. You've thought this through, Rebecca acknowledged. "But you're forgetting something important. Griffin isn't searching blindly for Victoria anymore. He knows she was at the hunting cabin, knows she fled when I arrived wounded. By now, his men will have found her trail, especially if she left tracks in the snow heading toward Mrs. Winters's cabin." Abigail's confident expression faltered slightly. "Mrs. Winters's cabin is difficult to approach unseen," she said. "And Victoria is clever. She would have taken precautions, covered her tracks as much as possible." In a deep snow after fleeing in haste, Rebecca shook her head. "We have to assume Griffin will find her at Mrs. Winters's, and soon. Which means your plan to free Mason and Sophia must succeed quickly before he discovers Victoria and uses that leverage against them." "Then we should go now," Abigail decided, gathering her supplies. "Can you ride?" Rebecca assessed her condition honestly. The wound had been well tended. The bleeding mostly stopped, but weakness from blood loss remained. Still, necessity often enabled feats beyond normal capacity. "I can ride," she said with more confidence than she felt. Not quickly, but well enough to reach the line shack. Abigail helped her to her feet, supporting her as they made their way to the door. "Mrs. Winters prepared for this possibility," she said. "She has horses hidden in a small ravine near her cabin, fresh mounts, for all of us once we free Mason and Sophia. With luck, we can be in Riverdale by dawn," the telegram sent to Marshal Blackwood, "before Griffin realizes his prisoners have escaped." "And Victoria Lily?" Rebecca asked as they stepped out into the biting cold of the night. "Mrs. Winters will see Lily safely to Riverdale once we send word that we've succeeded," Abigail assured her. "As for Victoria, well, she's survived 3 years of hiding. One more night won't defeat her." Rebecca wasn't so certain, but she kept her doubts to herself as they made their way to the barn where Abigail had left her horse. The young woman had clearly invested considerable thought and preparation into this plan. Dwelling on its potential weaknesses would serve no purpose now. As Abigail saddled her horse, Rebecca checked Dawson's still unconscious form, where they had dragged him into the barn. He breathed steadily, but showed no signs of waking soon. The blow to his head had been substantial. "What about him?" she asked, gesturing to the man. "When he wakes, he'll alert Griffin." Abigail considered this, then proceeded to bind Dawson's hands and feet with rope from the barn, gagging him with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. "That should hold him until we're well away," she said, tightening the final knot with practiced efficiency. "By the time anyone finds him, we'll be beyond Griffin's reach." They mounted the horse together, Rebecca behind Abigail, one arm wrapped around the younger woman's waist for stability, while the other pressed against her wounded side. The movement sent fresh pain through her, but she gritted her teeth against it, focusing on the task ahead. As they rode away from the ranch, taking a circuitous route to avoid potential encounters with Griffin's searching men, Rebecca found her thoughts turning to Mason and Sophia, prisoners in the line shack with no knowledge that help was coming. Would they resist, attempt escape on their own? Or would they await whatever fate Griffin had planned, believing Victoria safely hidden and therefore worth any personal sacrifice? And Victoria herself, would she remain at Mrs. Winters's cabin as instructed? Or would her concern for Mason and her sister drive her to reckless action? Rebecca knew the answer even as she formulated the question. Victoria had demonstrated her courage and determination repeatedly over the past 3 years. She would not passively await rescue while those she loved faced danger. The line shack appeared as they crested a small rise, a sturdy log structure with a single window and door, lantern light glowing from within. Abigail reined in their mount in a stand of pines some 100 yards distant, dismounting carefully to help Rebecca down. "2 men outside," Abigail observed in a whisper, pointing to the shadowy figures visible near the door. Likely more inside with the prisoners. How will you get all of them to drink the sedative? Rebecca asked, leaning against a tree for support. If some refuse. I've considered that, Abigail replied, producing a small flask from her satchel. Whiskey liberally dosed. Few men refuse a drink on a cold night, especially when offered by a young woman they consider harmless. The confidence in her tone suggested this wasn't the first time Abigail had used such tactics. Rebecca wondered briefly what other secrets the sheriff's daughter harbored, what experiences had shaped her into this quietly determined ally. Wait here, Abigail instructed, handing Rebecca a small Derringer pistol from her coat pocket. If I'm not back within half an hour, or if you hear anything that suggests the plan has failed, make your way back to the ranch. Take the horse and go to the Thompson farm where Lily is staying. Get her away from here as far as possible. Rebecca accepted the weapon, recognizing the gravity of the contingency plan. And you, if things go wrong... Abigail's smile was grim in the moonlight. I've lived with fear every day since my mother died, Miss Hayes. I'm prepared for whatever comes. She squeezed Rebecca's hand briefly. But let's hope for success instead, shall we? With that, she took the flask and a small basket she had prepared at the ranch, containing bread, cheese, and a pot of coffee, all laced with Mrs. Winters's sedative, and set off toward the line shack, her stride confident and unhurried. Rebecca watched from the shelter of the pines as Abigail approached the guards, her manner transformed into that of a demure young woman performing an errand for her father. Even at this distance, Rebecca could see the men straighten at her approach, their posture and gestures betraying interest in the unexpected female visitor. Abigail's performance was flawless. The dutiful daughter bringing refreshments at her father's request, concerned that Griffin's men might be cold and hungry during their night watch. She laughed at something one of the guards said, a bright sound carrying clearly in the still night air, and accepted a gallant offer to step inside out of the cold. And then she was gone, entering the line shack with her basket of drugged provisions, leaving Rebecca to wait and wonder whether the plan would succeed or fail catastrophically. The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. Rebecca kept the Derringer ready, her eyes fixed on the shack's door, straining to hear any sound that might indicate trouble. But the night remained quiet, the guards not reappearing outside, no raised voices or sounds of struggle disturbing the silence. Had Abigail succeeded so quickly, or had she walked into a trap, her deception discovered before she could administer the sedative? 20 minutes into her vigil, movement at the edge of Rebecca's vision drew her attention. A figure was approaching from the direction opposite the one Abigail had taken, moving with stealth through the shadows, clearly intent on the line shack. Rebecca raised the Derringer, trying to make out details in the moonlight. The figure was slight feminine in its movements, despite being bundled against the cold. As it passed through a patch of moonlight, Rebecca caught a glimpse of golden hair escaping from beneath a woolen hat. Victoria. Rebecca's heart sank. As she had feared, Victoria had not remained safely hidden at Mrs. Winter's cabin, but had followed Abigail, unwilling to entrust her husband and sister's rescue to others. There was no way to warn her that Abigail was already inside, that the plan was in motion. If Victoria approached the shack now, she might disrupt whatever progress Abigail had made, possibly endangering everyone involved. Making a swift decision, Rebecca pushed away from the tree and began moving as quietly as her wounded state allowed, intercepting Victoria before she could reach the clearing surrounding the shack. When they were within arm's reach of each other, Rebecca made a soft sound, just enough to alert Victoria to her presence without alerting the guards. Victoria froze, then turned slowly, one hand moving to what Rebecca guessed was a concealed weapon. Recognition dawned in her eyes, followed swiftly by shock at Rebecca's condition. "You're alive," she whispered, stepping closer. "When Griffin's men found your blood trail to the cabin, but didn't return with you. I feared the worst." "Abigail saved me," Rebecca explained quickly, keeping her voice low. "She's inside now, administering a sedative to Griffin's men. The plan is already in motion, Victoria. You need to wait here with me until she returns with Mason and Sophia." Victoria's gaze moved to the line shack, then back to Rebecca. "How long has she been inside?" 20 minutes, perhaps a bit more." "Too long," Victoria said grimly. "If the sedative worked as quickly as Lenora claimed, Abigail should have been out by now with Mason and Sophia. Something's wrong." Before Rebecca could respond, the door of the line shack opened, spilling golden lamplight onto the snow outside. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, male tall, and with the distinctive bearing that Rebecca had come to recognize instantly. Griffin Harlow. Victoria sucked in a sharp breath, instinctively drawing back into deeper shadow. "James," she whispered the single word laden with fear and loathing. "He wasn't searching for me with the others. He was waiting at the line shack all along." A trap, Rebecca realized. He anticipated Abigail might try to free Mason and Sophia. Perhaps he even expected you would come yourself. Griffin remained in the doorway, scanning the surrounding darkness as if sensing unseen watchers. After a moment, he stepped fully outside, dragging someone with him. Abigail, her arms bound behind her, her earlier confidence replaced by obvious fear. "Victoria Blackwood," Griffin called into the night, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I know you're out there watching. Your young friend here was kind enough to confirm you survived our little encounter 3 years ago. How disappointing that you couldn't face me yourself, sending this girl instead, to free your husband and sister." Victoria trembled beside Rebecca, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "He'll kill her," she whispered, "just to draw me out." "That's his plan," Rebecca agreed, "but if you reveal yourself, he wins. Mason, Sophia, Abigail, all of them forfeit. You're the prize he sought for 3 years, Victoria. Once he has you, the others become expendable." Griffin, growing impatient with the lack of response, pressed a knife to Abigail's throat. "Perhaps you need motivation, Victoria," he called. "I'll start with the girl, then move on to your sister. By the time I reach Mason, I imagine you'll have found your courage." "I have to go to him," Victoria said, her decision made. "I can't let them die because of me." Rebecca caught her arm, holding her in place with surprising strength, given her weakened condition. "Wait," she urged. "Griffin expects immediate surrender or resistance. Give him neither, let him wonder, let his uncertainty grow. It may be our only advantage." Victoria hesitated clearly, torn between immediate action and the wisdom of Rebecca's counsel. In that moment of indecision, a new sound broke the night's silence, hoofbeats approaching rapidly from the direction of the ranch. Griffin heard it too, his head turning toward the sound. He dragged Abigail back inside the line shack, closing the door, but leaving it unbarred, an invitation for Victoria to enter, or perhaps confidence that his men would intercept any rescue attempt. "Someone's coming," Rebecca said unnecessarily, straining to see through the darkness. "Griffin's men returning from their search, or—" "Look!" Victoria interrupted, pointing to the approaching riders now visible in the moonlight. "That's not Griffin's men. That's—" She trailed off in disbelief as the riders drew close enough to identify a group of perhaps 10 mounted figures led by a man whose badge glinted silver in the moonlight. Behind him rode uniformed deputies, rifles at the ready. "The marshal," Rebecca breathed. "But how Abigail said it would take days for him to reach us from Helena." "He was already on his way," came a voice from behind them. Mrs. Winters appearing like a wraith from the shadows of the forest. Been tracking Griffin for weeks, gathering evidence. When Victoria arrived at my cabin, I sent my boy Jeremiah to intercept the marshal's party on the North Road. Told him everything: Griffin's return, the captives at the line shack, Victoria's survival. Victoria stared at the old woman in amazement. "Your boy? I didn't know you had a son." A ghost of a smile touched Mrs. Winters's weathered face. "Not my son by birth. One of many young men I've helped over the years, orphans, runaways, lost souls. Jeremiah works as a trapper in these parts, knows every trail and shortcut. Marshal Blackwood and his men were less than 10 miles away when my message reached them." The riders had reached the line shack, now surrounding it with practiced efficiency. The marshal himself dismounted, approaching the door with 2 deputies flanking him. "Griffin Harlow," he called, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of federal law. "This is Marshal Joshua Blackwood. You're surrounded by federal deputies with warrants for your arrest on charges of fraud, impersonation, and suspected murder. Come out with your hands visible and bring any hostages with you." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened slowly, and Griffin emerged alone, his hands raised in apparent surrender. But Rebecca, watching closely, noted the calculating look in his eyes, the tension in his posture, suggesting a man preparing to strike rather than submit. "Marshal Blackwood," Griffin greeted him with convincing affability. "There seems to be some misunderstanding. I'm merely a businessman examining some property I recently acquired. There are no hostages here, only employees and associates." "We'll determine that for ourselves," the marshal replied, gesturing for his deputies to enter the shack. "Meanwhile, you'll surrender any weapons and accompany us to town for questioning." Griffin's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened to chips of ice. "Of course, Marshal. Though I must warn you, my friend Sheriff Caldwell takes a dim view of federal interference in local matters. Perhaps we should consult him before proceeding with this misunderstanding. Sheriff Caldwell has been relieved of his duties pending investigation into corruption charges," Marshal Blackwood informed him coldly. "His cooperation with certain criminal elements in the territory has not gone unnoticed by my office." For the first time, Griffin's confident facade cracked slightly. He glanced toward the trees, perhaps seeking escape routes or hidden allies, his gaze passing over the very spot where Rebecca, Victoria, and Mrs. Winters concealed themselves. In that moment, Victoria stepped forward, emerging from the shadows into the moonlight. "Hello, James," she said, her voice steady, despite the slight tremor in her hands. "Or should I call you Griffin now?" Griffin's expression transformed at the sight of her, shock, then triumph, then calculating rage in rapid succession. "Victoria," he acknowledged, recovering quickly. "Back from the dead, I see. How convenient that you appear just as the marshal arrives with his absurd accusations." "Not accusations," Marshal Blackwood corrected. "Evidence. Substantial evidence from multiple sources, including financial records seized from your office in Helena, testimonies from former associates, and a rather detailed journal documenting your activities over the past 3 years." As he spoke, deputies emerged from the line shack, supporting Mason, battered but conscious, and Sophia, her wrists still bearing rope marks. Behind them came Abigail, visibly shaken but unharmed. Victoria rushed to them, embracing her sister first, then Mason, tears flowing freely down her face. "I thought I'd lost you both," she whispered loud enough for Rebecca to hear from her position at the edge of the clearing. "When Griffin captured you, your friends proved more resourceful than I anticipated." Griffin interrupted, his tone conversational, despite the deputies now flanking him. "The young Miss Caldwell in particular. Who would have thought the sheriff's daughter harbored such resentment toward authority, though her attempt to drug my men was amateur at best. They were never your men, Blackwood, the marshal said grimly. Jenkins, Monroe, Dawson, all undercover deputies working under my direction for the past month. Your legitimate hired guns were easy enough to isolate and detain once we knew your movements. This revelation finally shattered Griffin's composure. He lunged suddenly, producing a small derringer from his sleeve, and aiming not at the marshal, but at Victoria, his face contorted with the rage he had concealed beneath his civilized veneer. "If I can't have her, no one will," he snarled, finger tightening on the trigger. Several things happened simultaneously. Mason threw himself in front of Victoria. Marshal Blackwood drew and fired with remarkable speed, and from the edge of the clearing, Rebecca squeezed the trigger of Abigail's derringer, aiming as best she could in her weakened state. 2 shots rang out in the night, then a third. Griffin staggered, a look of disbelief crossing his features as blood blossomed on his chest from 2 separate wounds. He took one halting step forward, eyes fixed on Victoria with undimmed hatred, then collapsed face first into the snow. For a moment, the tableau held Griffin's motionless form, surrounded by armed deputies, Victoria clutching Mason, who had been prepared to die for her, Sophia and Abigail, supporting each other in shared shock. Then, Marshal Blackwood broke the silence, holstering his weapon and turning to his men. "Secure the scene," he ordered. "Check if Harlow Blackwood, whatever his name is still alive. If so, bind his wounds. He'll hang properly after a trial, not bleed out in the snow." As the deputies moved to obey, Rebecca sagged against Mrs. Winters, the last of her strength finally deserting her. The old woman supported her with surprising strength, helping her toward the gathering in the clearing. "It's over," Mrs. Winters said softly. "Truly over after all these years." Rebecca wasn't entirely convinced. Too many loose ends remained, too many questions unanswered. But as Victoria caught sight of her and rushed to embrace her, as Mason's eyes met hers with profound gratitude, as Sophia pressed her hands in silent thanks, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps the worst had indeed passed. The nightmare that had begun 3 years ago in a blizzard, much like the one that had brought Rebecca to Blackwood Ranch, had finally ended in another snow-covered night. James Blackwood Griffin Harlow would threaten them no more whether he survived his wounds or not. The truth would emerge, justice would follow its course, and the long period of hiding and fear would give way to healing and eventually peace. As Marshal Blackwood approached to question them, Rebecca felt consciousness beginning to slip away, her wound and exhaustion finally claiming their due. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was Victoria's face, transformed by a smile of such profound relief and joy that it seemed to illuminate the night more brightly than the moon above.